The sun never sets, the empire on which the sun never sets. These words, once uttered with pride in London drawing rooms and colonial outposts alike, captured an astonishing reality. At its height, Britain's dominions spanned so many longitudes that, at any hour of day or night, the British flag flew beneath the sun's gaze somewhere on earth. From the windswept Cornwalls of home to jungle-shrouded India, from the plains of Canada to the reefs of Australia. This empire emerged from an island nation's restless ambition and grew into a network of trade, conquest, and political influence unmatched in human history. How did a modest collection of kingdoms and shires, united under Norman monarchs, stabilized by Tudor rule master the oceans, colonize distant lands, and knit together cultures separated by oceans and centuries? The answer unfolds through voyages of daring Elizabethan sea dogs, the establishment of trading companies seizing spice routes, and the grim realities of plantation economies built on forced labor. Over 4 centuries, British merchants, missionaries, soldiers, and administrators extended their reach from an archipelago in the North Atlantic to every continent except Antarctica, reshaping the world's economies, societies, and even its map. Yet this transformation carried profound contradictions. Back at home, the British prided themselves on the rule of law, parliamentary freedoms, and notions of individual rights values, often celebrated in poetry, pamphlets, and parliamentary debates. Across the globe, however, those same ideals collided with the subjugation and dispossession of indigenous peoples. Enslaved Africans labored on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, while local leaders in India negotiated alliances that would ultimately erode their autonomy under the shadow of the crown. The British Empire thus became a paradox, a champion of liberty for some, an agent of coercion for others. This is not a story of unbroken triumph, nor is it one of unrelieved oppression. It is, instead, a chronicle of adaptation, conflict, innovation, and ultimately transformation for Britain, for its colonies, and for the world at large. We begin with the Elizabethan voyages of the late 16th century, the daring circumnavigations of Francis Drake and the bold but ill-fated settlements attempted by Walter Raleigh. These expeditions cemented England's claim to the seas and heralded the birth of an overseas presence, even as they courted the wrath of Spain and its mighty armada. From these slippery footholds in the New World emerged the first permanent colonies in Virginia and Newfoundland outposts that would, over time, evolve into settler societies with their own identities. Simultaneously, back in Africa and Asia, British merchants formed chartered companies, chartered by royal decree, carving triangular networks of commerce between Europe, Africa's Atlantic coast, and India's trading ports. They shipped silk, cotton, tea, and opium, forging wealth that would feed Britain's industrial revolution and underwriting the expansion of railways, telegraph lines, and a global postal system. Yet, as Britain built an empire, it also planted the seeds of its own unraveling. Colonial administrations stimulated local elites, introduced European education, and raised armies drawn from colonial subjects only to find those very soldiers and bureaucrats, cated and emboldened, demanding self-government. The ideals of the Enlightenment and the victories of the American Revolution echoed around the globe, conjuring the legitimacy of rule by distant monarchs and parliaments. The ultimate dissolution of the empire was as complex as its rise. After 2 catastrophic world wars, Britain's exhausted economy and emerging American and Soviet superpowers hastened decolonization, India's hard-won independence. In 1947, accompanied by the trauma of partition, marked the beginning of a new age. In the decades that followed, one colony after another shed the imperial yoke, from Ghana in Africa to Malaysia in Southeast Asia. By 1997, When Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty, the old phrase had lost its literal edge. The sun still shone on British flags in a handful of territories, but the vast dominion of earlier centuries was gone. And yet, Akia, the empire's imprint endures in legal systems from Canada to Kenya, in cricket pitches from Mumbai to Melbourne, in the English language spoken by billions, and in global institutions such as the Commonwealth. This story will carry us through 400 years of exploration, trade, war, administration, and ultimately, decolonization. As you settle in, let us drift gently through time, tracing how a small island built, governed, and unwove the largest empire the world has known, an empire that, though largely vanished, still shapes our present in ways both subtle and profound. Beginnings, exploration, piracy, and the Elizabethan sea dogs in the waning years of the 16th century. England was a restless island nation, reborn under Elizabeth I, eager to test the limits of its maritime prowess. It was an age when the known world expanded by the day, and England's boldest captains set sail to stake their claims both in gold and glory. Among these pioneers, two names stand out: Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. Their exploits, part privateering, part exploration, laid the groundwork for England's transformation from European backwater to global power. Francis Drake, born around 1540 in the port town of Tavistock, grew up among fishermen and shipwrights. His youth coincided with mounting tension between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. By 1570, Drake was already making a name as a daring seafarer, captaining small merchant vessels and, more lucratively, intercepting Spanish treasure ships off the Azores. In 1572, he led a flotilla that sacked Spanish ports along Panama's Pacific, coasting audacious strike across the Isthmus of Darien. While declared a pirate by Spain, he was hailed as a hero in London. His greatest achievement came between 1577 and 1580, when he commanded the Golden Hind on the second circumnavigation of the globe by an Englishman, laden with treasures, silks, spices. Peruvian Silver Drake returned triumphantly, knighted by Queen Elizabeth on the deck of his ship. Though nominally a privateer commissioned under letters of marque, Drake's voyage demonstrated that England could challenge Iberian dominance of the seas. Meanwhile, Walter Raleigh, knight, courtier, and poetic visionary, pursued a cargo of a different kind. Born in 1552 into a gentry family in Devon, Raleigh rose swiftly at Elizabeth's court, where his intelligence and charm won the Queen's favor. He nurtured grand schemes of colonization. In 1585, Raleigh outfitted an expedition to Roanoke Island, on the coast of what is now North Carolina, aiming to establish the first English colony in the Americas. Although the lost colony vanished under mysterious circumstances, Raleigh's efforts proved that England could plant settlements across the Atlantic. He followed this with voyages seeking gold and seeking to map the continent's interior. Though his ambitions ultimately outpaced his resources, and he would later fall from Elizabeth's grace, Raleigh's dream of an English New World captured the national imagination. These early ventures were not undertaken purely for conquest. They served the twin engines of commerce and piracy. England had long traded low volumes of wool and cloth to northern Europe, but the lure of African gold, American tobacco, and Asian spices promised riches beyond anything the North Sea markets could supply. English merchants formed embryonic companies, precursors to corporate giants, sending ships to barter cloth and metal goods for ivory and gold on the African coast, and for cod, furs, and sassafras in the North American fishery. Private investors, driven by profit rather than patriotism, poured capital into voyages whose backers expected a return many times their stake. At the same time, England's sea dogs, licensed pirates, bent their energies toward Spain's treasure fleets, operating out of ports like Plymouth and Bristol. They operated under ambiguous legal cover, letters of marque, authorized attacks on enemy ships during wartime. But English privateers often struck juicy Spanish prizes during periods of uneasy peace. Each successful raid enriched its captain and crew, bolstered the crown's coffers via prizes taken on board Queen Elizabeth's ships, and weakened Spain's maritime monopoly on New World silver and gold. Trade with Africa also took root. In this era, while the transatlantic slave trade would later eclipse other commerce in moral infamy, early English voyages focused on gold and ivory. Portuguese and Dutch traders long dominated the West African coast, but English interlopers, backed by private companies, established trading posts at places like Elmina and those later chartered by the Royal African Company. These outposts exchanged cloth, metal wares, and firearms for gold dust, which was then transported to London's exchange, fueling both enterprise and empire-building across the Atlantic. The first forays into North America revealed a land of rich fisheries and fertile soil. John Hawkins's early expeditions to Newfoundland and the Caribbean in the 1560s returned with cod, sugar, and captured Africans grafted into the burgeoning triangular trade. By the 1580s, English merchants regularly traded cloth for tobacco, leaf in Virginia and Maryland, laying the foundations of a transatlantic network that would one day bind the empire's fortunes to its American colonies. Thus, in the 16th century's final decades, England's maritime pioneers Drake and Raleigh, chief among them, opened new horizons. Their voyages of plunder and settlement demonstrated that a determined island nation could compete with Spain and Portugal. They forged the first commercial ties with Africa and the Americas, planting the seeds of mercantile capitalism and colonial ambition. With every captain's return and every laden ship, England's appetite for overseas adventure grew, setting the course for an empire that would span the globe. The Sea Dogs had charted the way forward, and the currents of commerce and conflict would carry their heirs to ever greater heights, since deeper controversies the centuries to come. By the late 16th century, England's maritime adventurers had set the stage for a broader contest on the world's oceans. Their early voyages and privateering ventures brought wealth and confidence, but also invited a formidable adversary. Spain, whose vast empire in the Americas funded its powerful navy, the Armada. What followed was a fierce rivalry that forged the foundations of English naval supremacy and paved the way for permanent settlements in North America. Spain's wealth, drawn from silver mines in Mexico and Peru, financed a fleet of galleons protecting treasure convoys between the Caribbean and Seville. English privateers, operating under letters of marque from Queen Elizabeth, targeted these convoys, striking at the heart of Spanish power. They captured richly laden ships, bringing back cargoes of gold, pearls, and indigo. Each raid enriched the crown's treasury, which collected a share of prizes, and weakened Spain's grip on its American domains. In response, King Philip II of Spain assembled the Spanish Armada in 1588, intending to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and end privateering at its source. The Spanish fleet of some 130 ships, carrying thousands of troops, set sail for the English Channel. Yet, the English navy, smaller in number, but faster and more maneuverable, employed innovative tactics. Commanders like Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake used long-range galleons and fireships to scatter the Spanish formation. A series of engagements in the Channel and storms in the North Sea decimated the Armada, the original fleet. Only half returned to Spain, battered by cannon fire and the unpredictable winds. The defeat of the Armada marked a turning point. England's victory was celebrated as divine favor and broadcast across Europe, signaling the birth of English naval power. Shipyards on the Thames and along the south coast accelerated construction of sturdy, swift galleons. Naval administration improved, officers received standardized training. Spy sailing vessels known as flyboats and hulks joined the fight. The establishment of the Navy Office in 1546 and its refinements under Elizabeth created centralized oversight of shipbuilding, manning, and provisions, fostering a professional service rather than ad hoc private fleets, empowered by this naval dominance. English entrepreneurs and chartered companies renewed their ambitions for overseas colonies. In 1606, King James I granted 2 charters, one to the Virginia Company of London for territory north of the 34th parallel, and another to the Virginia Company of Plymouth further north. These charters provided joint stock backing, financial incentives, and governance structures for settling North America. The companies promised their investors returns from gold, valuable commodities, potential trade routes, while settlers were drawn by prospects of land ownership and venture, and relief from economic pressures at home. In April 1607, 3 ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, sailed into Chesapeake Bay and founded Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The early years at Jamestown were brutal. Disease, famine, and conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy claimed many lives. Yet, the colonists learned to cultivate tobacco under the guidance of John Rolfe and to negotiate fragile truces with native tribes. Tobacco quickly emerged as Virginia's cash crop, transforming the colony's economy and attracting fresh waves of settlers. Simultaneously, other English efforts took root. In Newfoundland, fishermen from West Country ports established seasonal outposts at St. John's and Fairyland, exchanging cured cod for English goods, though early attempts at permanent settlement foundered in harsh winters. These stations created the blueprint for resource-driven colonization. Further south, in 1620, religious dissenters aboard the Mayflower established Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. Their compact, setting up a government based on majority rule, reflected English traditions of self-governance and imbued the new society with ideals that would influence future colonial charters. Through rivalry with Spain and the strategic defeat of its armada, England secured the seas for its merchant ventures and colonial ambitions. By combining naval innovation with joint stock funding and religious motivation, the first North American colonies, Jamestown, Plymouth, and Newfoundland fishing stations became footholds for an empire that would expand across oceans and centuries. These nascent settlements, forged in hardship and sustained by maritime connections, laid the groundwork for an imperial network that stretched from the British Isles to the New World, heralding the globe-spanning reach that would define Britain's future as the empire on which the sun never sets. Plantations and colonies. The 17th century. In the opening years of the 17th century, England's ambitions in North America coalesced around a charter granted by King James I to the Virginia Company of London. This joint stock corporation, formed in 1606, promised investors shares in any profits arising from trade, precious metals, and land in the territory between 34 and 41 north latitude. Setting sail in December of 1606, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, carried 120-odd men and boys across the Atlantic. In April 1607, they established Jamestown on a marshy peninsula in Chesapeake Bay, naming the settlement in honor of their monarch. Jamestown's first years were marked by hardship. The site, chosen for its defensibility, lacked safe drinking water and was surrounded by dense forest. Colonists arrived unprepared for winter's chill or the unfamiliar diseases carried by mosquitoes. Relations with the local Powhatan Confederacy were uneasy, at times cooperative, as when Captain John Smith negotiated for food, and at others hostile, as when raids threatened the fragile outpost. Starvation, sickness, and internecine conflicts reduced the population dramatically. With nearly half succumbing within the first year, the colony's survival owed much to its shift from gold-seeking to a more sustainable cash crop, tobacco. In 1612, John Rolfe successfully cultivated Nicotiana tabacama, milder strain than indigenous varieties, and began exporting cured leaf to England. Demand for smoking tobacco in European markets soared, transforming Jamestown's fortunes. Land grants, called head rights, encouraged new settlers by offering 50 acres to anyone who paid for an immigrant's passage. Families and investors planted tobacco on sprawling plantations tended by indentured servants. By the 1620s, Virginia had exported hundreds of thousands of pounds of tobacco annually, generating profits that underpinned colonial expansion. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, England's first colonial ventures followed a parallel and even more dramatic path. In 1623 and 1624, English settlers from Barbados, under license from the Earl of Carlisle, began establishing sugarcane plantations on the island's fertile coastal plains. Sugar, once a luxury commodity in Europe, found new profitability through advances in refining technology and refinements in plantation management. Sturdy European mills powered by wind and water began grinding cane, while large stone sugar boilers processed the juice into raw sugar and molasses. Barbados's climate proved ideal. Abundant sunshine, generous rainfall, and flat terrain supported dense fields of cane. The initial planters imported indentured laborers from England, but as demand grew and mortality rates remained high, they increasingly relied on enslaved Africans transported via the emerging triangular trade. By mid-17th century, Barbados had become one of England's wealthiest colonies, exporting large barrels of sugar and molasses back to London. Profits financed the construction of grand plantation great houses, elaborate gardens, and local Anglican churches, symbols of a new planter aristocracy. The success of sugar cultivation in Barbados inspired English colonization of other Caribbean islands. St. Kitts, shared initially with the French, saw sugar estates flourish by the 1640s. Jamaica, seized from Spain in 1655, rapidly transformed under English rule into a sugar powerhouse, its plantations dotting the lowlands and sending shiploads of sugar and rum to Europe and North America. Each colony developed its own plantation society, underpinned by hierarchical social structures: white planters and merchants at the top, small freeholders and artisans in the middle, and enslaved Africans at the bottom. These Caribbean colonies, more than Jamestown, demonstrated the economic potential and human cost of plantation agriculture. Mortality was horrific, with life expectancy for newly arrived laborers measured in just a few years. Planters justified the system through emerging racial ideologies that dehumanized Africans, while colonial governors enacted laws codifying racial slavery and hereditary servitude. The wealth generated fueled Britain's growing maritime power, financed wars in Europe, and enriched merchants in Bristol and London. Back in Virginia, the model of large estates expanded to mirror Caribbean practices. Some planters experimented with sugarcane, but Virginia's climate proved less suitable, and tobacco remained king. Nevertheless, the social and economic patterns concentrated in the hands of a planter elite, laborers bound by indenture or bondage. In the colony's interests aligned with metropolitan investors, gold the Caribbean experience. By the century's close, England's Atlantic holdings formed a vast network of plantation economies. Jamestown had overcome its precarious beginnings to become the first permanent English colony on the continent, its tobacco trade securing its survival. At the same time, sugar plantations in the Caribbean had transformed tiny islands into engines of wealth and sorrow, laying bare the contradictions of empire building. This dual pattern of settlement tobacco in North America, sugar in the tropics would shape British colonial policy well into the 18th century, knitting together commerce, conquest, and a plantation system that would leave indelible marks on the modern world, while tobacco and sugar defined England's Atlantic plantation economies. Equally transformative and contentious were the island's ventures closer to home in Ireland, and across the sea in the rich fur lands of northern Canada. These simultaneous enterprises illustrate how English colonization blended commercial ambition with the military force, reshaping multiple continents in the process settlement of Ireland and the Cromwellian conquest by the early 17th century. The English crown had long viewed Ireland as both a strategic foothold and a source of religious and social tension. Elizabeth I's plantations in Ulster during the 1590s had introduced English and Scottish Protestant settlers onto confiscated Gaelic lands, sowing the seeds of conflict. Under James I, the plantation of Ulster accelerated. Dispossessed Irish landowners were replaced with English landlords who imported tenants loyal to the crown. English law replaced Brehon customary law. Protestant churches appeared alongside or instead of Catholic shrines. Tensions erupted into full-scale rebellion during the Irish Rebellion of 1641, when Catholic Irish rebels rose against perceived oppression, massacring settler communities and seizing castles. The English and Scottish responses were brutal. When Oliver Cromwell landed in Ireland in 1649 with a new model army, his campaign combined sieges, punitive massacres, and mass land confiscations. At Drogheda and Wexford, Cromwell's forces executed garrisons and civilians alike, believing that terror would pacify resistance. Subsequent legislation disenfranchised Catholic landowners. Estates were transferred to soldiers as payment for service or to Protestant settlers as rewards, radically altering Ireland's demographics and property relations. By the Restoration in 1660, the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland was firmly entrenched, governed by English-appointed Lords Lieutenant and controlled by Anglican landlords. Catholic participation in political life was all but eliminated under the penal laws, which barred them from owning land or holding public office. These developments, conceived as security measures against rebellion, instead institutionalized sectarian divisions whose echoes would persist for centuries. The plantation model, transplanting a loyal settler population over conquered territory, thus reached its harshest expression in Ireland, where economic exploitation, religious displacement, and cultural suppression intertwined. Establishment of Hudson's Bay Company in Canada, stark contrast to the violence of Ireland's plantations. The northern reaches of North America witnessed a largely commercial-driven colonization. In 1670, King Charles II chartered the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, granting it exclusive trading rights over the vast watershed draining into Hudson Bay area called Rupert's Land. The HBC's objective was straightforward: trade European goods, textiles, metal tools, firearms, for fur pelts, especially beaver, prized in Europe for fashionable hats, rather than immediate settlement. The HBC erected a network of fortified trading posts to York Factory, Fort Prince of Wales, and Albany Fort Ware Company factors offered trade goods to Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuit trappers, indigenous traders, comfortable navigating the frozen rivers and lakes, brought pelts in exchange for axes, knives, and woolen cloth. Annual convoys of HBC ships arrived at Hudson Bay in summer, loading thousands of pelts before sailing for London. This stay-by-the-bay strategy, only from fixed posts, differed from the roving fur brigades of the rival Northwest Company, which penetrated deep into the interior. The HBC's early monopoly extended under successive royal charters, made it one of the world's longest-lived corporations. Its activities spurred limited settlement by European employees and their Medius families. But the company largely deferred formal colonization to avoid antagonizing powerful indigenous trading partners. Instead, it fostered alliances through marriage, alafacon, dupays, mutual gift exchange, and respect for native leadership. Forts often functioned as impromptu councils where treaties were negotiated, disputes settled, and trading norms established. Over time, however, the dynamics of power shifted as competition from French fur traders intensified. The HBC adapted by organizing York Factory Express Brigade's overland routes, linking Hudson Bay to the Columbia River expanding posts into modern Ontario and Manitoba. Company law, administered by factors and sometimes enforced by armed detachments, began to resemble colonial governance, regulating trade, granting licenses, and imposing fines. Though administrators rarely ventured into large-scale agriculture, they laid the groundwork for permanent settlements like Fort Vancouver in Winnipeg. By the late 18th century, the Canadian fur trade linked the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, knitting Rupert's Land into a global commerce of beaver pelts in European markets. The HBC's presence facilitated mapping expeditions and scientific surveys, bringing knowledge of the northern interior to London. It also set a pattern for chartered companies Atenas wielding governmental powers in exchange for commercial monopoly, a model repeated in India's East India Company and in chartered ventures across Africa to gather the violent plantations of Ireland and the lucrative fur outposts of Canada. Illustrate the range of English colonial methods in the 17th century. In Ireland, colonization took the form of aggressive land seizure and religious repression. In Canada, it emerged through negotiated commerce and corporate governance. Both experiences, however divergent in tone, underscored a common theme: England's transformation of an island nation into a global empire relied on adapting colonial strategies to local conditions, sometimes brutally, sometimes pragmatically, but always with a keen eye to profit and sovereignty across the water. Trade and power. The East India Company on December 31st, 1600. A group of London merchants received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I to establish the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. This East India Company, EIC, was granted a monopoly over all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. Vast concession encompassing the Indian Ocean and the coasts of South and Southeast Asia. Initially, the company's capital was modest. Several £100,000 sterling was contributed by shareholders, expected high returns from the fabled riches of India and the Spice Islands. In 1601, the EIC dispatched its first fleet of 4 small ships: Stride, Dragon, Hector, Ascension, and Susan under the command of Captain James Lancaster. Lancaster's voyage marked England's entry into long-distance maritime trade, previously dominated by the Portuguese and the Dutch. After navigating the Cape of Good Hope, his fleet arrived at Swali near Surat on the northwest coast of India. In 1608, impressed by English cannons and seeking to balance Portuguese power, the Sultan of Gujarat granted Lancaster permission to establish a factoria fortified warehouse where English merchants could store and trade English cotton cloth for Indian fabrics, indigo dye, and the prized pepper and cardamom that commanded enormous profits in European markets. These early footholds, Swali, Bantam in present-day Indonesia, and subsequently Masulipattanamal, the EIC, to compete with Dutch and Portuguese rivals. The company's ships navigated the monsoon-driven trade routes, timing departures from London to harness the southwest monsoon that blew across the Indian Ocean each summer, then returning with the northeast monsoon. This rhythm defined the EIC's operations. Ships loaded with woolen cloth, lead, tin, and silver sailed east in spring, while return voyages carried spices, textiles, precious gems westward to London's docks in autumn. By the mid-17th century, the EIC's network of factories had grown along India's coastline. At Madras, now Chennai, in 1639. At Bombay, Mumbai acquired as part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry in 1661. And at Calcutta, established in 1690. Each factory served as both trading post and diplomatic outpost. Company factors negotiated treaties with local nawabs, secured warehouse sites, and, when necessary, employed small armed guards to protect English interests against local competitors and pirate attacks. The arrival of the first EIC chaplains and the establishment of churches in these settlements also mirrored the company's dual commercial and cultural ambitions. As competition intensified, the EIC broadened its trade routes beyond pepper and cardamom. English merchants sought the luxury textiles of India, the finely woven calicos and muslins of Gujarat and Bengal. These fabrics, light, soft, and decorated with intricate dyes, captivated European consumers. The triangular trade from England to India and onward to the Ottoman Empire, where English cloth was exchanged for silk and raw silk threads, further enriched the company's merchants in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The EIC also entered the tea trade, initially importing inferior black teas from China, sold at high prices to London's coffee houses. When tea drinking caught on among the English elite, demand soared. Recognizing the potential for greater profit, the EIC secured its first Chinese tea monopoly through a separate charter in 1698, sending opium from Bengal to Guangzhou in exchange for tea and porcelain, though opium's trade would later cause controversy and conflict. In the early 1700s, it proved a lucrative means to balance the EIC's bullion deficits. Silver drained from London to pay for tea. This expansion of commodities from spices and textiles to tea required an extensive logistical network, fast clipper ships, well-stocked warehouses, and agents in European ports. In London, the company's headquarters at East India House became a center of power, with directors debating voyages, dividends, and charters. Share prices rose as profits soared, drawing new investors and fueling the EIC's transformation from a merchant consortium into a formidable corporate power with quasi-governmental authority. By the early 18th century, the EIC had entrenched itself as both trader and political actor in India. Its early footholds, Swali, Bantam, and Madras, were no longer mere warehouses, but springboards for territorial influence. The company's factors wielded pistols and cannons as deftly as they did ledgers and quill pens. Yet these developments also sowed the seeds of future conflict, as the EIC's officers negotiated increasingly favorable terms from indebted Indian rulers. They began to interfere in succession disputes and tax farming, blending commerce with political ambition. These were the roots of an empire within an empire merchant company that would one day govern vast territories, administer justice, and field its own armies, shaping the destiny of the subcontinent for centuries to come. By the late 17th century, the East India Company had established its trading footholds. But commercial success hinged on more than friendly treaties. It needed to outmaneuver Dutch and Portuguese rivals who dominated the Asian seas. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, chartered in 1602, boasted a formidable fleet and extensive bases in Indonesia. Meanwhile, the Portuguese Estado da India, with Goa as its capital since 1510, claimed exclusive rights to the lucrative spice trade. Battles with Dutch and Portuguese rivals often erupted in the waters of the Indian Ocean and the archipelagos of Southeast Asia in the mid-17th century. English vessels clashed with Portuguese carracks off the Malabar coast. At the Battle of Swali in 1612, Captain Thomas Best's squadron repelled Portuguese galleons near Surat, securing English trade privileges from local sultans, impressed by the display of cannon and seamanship. This victory earned the English a permanent factory at Swali and signaled Portugal's waning grip on Indian ocean commerce. Similarly, skirmishes with the VOC erupted around Bantam, present-day Banten, in West Java and Surabaya, where English and Dutch factors competed to export pepper and cloves. In 1619, the Dutch consolidated power by establishing Batavia on Java's north coast, effectively cutting off English access to their preferred spice-growing regions. The EIC responded by shifting its focus to the Coromandel coast of India and to Bengal's textile markets, exporting cotton cloth in exchange for spices and precious stones. Though direct naval confrontations with the VOC became less frequent, The rivalry forced the EIC to diversify its trade portfolio, fostering alliances with rulers in Madras, Calicut, and Hooghly, who sought to maintain leverage against Dutch pressure. By the early 18th century, the Portuguese had retreated to a handful of enclaves, Goa, Daman, and demanding monopoly only by leveraging PayPal and royal backing. English privateers and company ships sometimes attacked Portuguese ships carrying gold from Brazil and India's western ports. These raiding expeditions, though unofficial, further eroded Portuguese power and enriched the EIC's coffers. Meanwhile, Dutch influence in the Spice Islands remained strong, but the EIC's deep penetration of India's textile, indigo, and tea trades allowed it to outcompete the VOC on economic terms by taking advantage of India's vast population. The English supplied cloth far cheaper and in greater quantities than Dutch producers could manage, with maritime rivals contained. The EIC's gradual political involvement in the Indian subcontinent intensified. Initially, the company had professed to be merely a trading enterprise, not to meddle in religion, war, or policy, as company charters decreed. Yet, the distinction between commerce and governance blurred as early as the late 17th century, when the Mughal Empire's weakening central authority forced local governors, subadars, and nawabs to rely on European companies to maintain revenue flows and suppress rebellions in Bengal. The EIC's factory at Hooghly prospered under the protection of the Nawab Siraj Dullah, who permitted unimpeded trade in exchange for customs duties. However, by 1756, Siraj resented the company's exemption from tariffs and its fortification of Calcutta, formerly known as Fort William. The siege of Calcutta that year saw the Nawab's troops overrun the poorly defended settlement, imprisoning English civilians in the infamous Black Hole. The EIC responded under Robert Clive with decisive force at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Clive's small force, aided by treachery within the Nawab's court, defeated Siraj's army, reinstated him as a puppet ruler, secured revenue rights in Bengal for the company. This victory marked the EIC's first major political dominion in India. It now controlled taxation, administered justice through its own courts, and maintained an army of sepoys loyal to company pay. Other battles followed. The Battle of Buxar in 1764 confirmed EIC hegemony over Awadh and Bengal. And the Regulating Act of 1773 created a Governor-General of India, formalizing the company's administrative functions under parliamentary oversight. By the end of the 18th century, the EIC had moved from warehouses and trading factories to becoming the de facto government for tens of millions of Indians, collecting land revenue, waging wars with neighboring states, and shaping the subcontinent's political landscape. Thus, the East India Company's trajectory from commercial charter to territorial power demonstrates distinct progression. Maritime battles against Dutch and Portuguese rivals secured its trade networks, while strategic interventions, often cloaked in commercial pretexts, allowed it to supplant regional powers. By extending its influence beyond commerce, the EIC became the architect of British rule in India, foreshadowing the direct crown governance that would follow in 1858 after the Sepoy Rebellion. In this way, trade and power were inseparable for the company's step of political involvement built upon the competitive successes achieved on the high seas. Empire and revolution. America lost, elsewhere gained by the mid-18th century. Britain's imperial ambitions clashed head-on with those of France and other European powers. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, often described as the first true global conflict, saw Britain and France and their respective allies fight across Europe, North America, India, Africa, and the Caribbean. For Britain, it became an opportunity to consolidate its dominion in North America and expand its foothold in the Indian subcontinent in North America. The war erupted over contested territories in the Ohio Valley and along the Great Lakes. Colonial militias funded by governors in Boston and Virginia, skirmished with French trappers and their Native American allies. When full-scale war broke out in 1756, Britain committed its army and navy to the conflict. Early setbacks such as General Braddock's disastrous defeat near Fort Kane in 1755 were followed by strategic victories under leaders like General James Wolfe in 1759. Wolfe's daring ascent of the cliffs at Quebec led to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where he fell mortally wounded but secured a decisive blow against French Canada. Within weeks, Montreal surrendered, ceding all of New France to British control. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized Britain's gains. Canada came most of Florida, ceded by Spain in exchange for Havana and key Caribbean islands, passed into British hands. In the Indian Ocean, Britain's victories at Plassey 1757 and Wandiwash 1760 undermined French power in India. French trading posts were forced to close, and the EIC secured sweeping rights to collect revenue in Bengal. These triumphs established Britain not only as the preeminent naval force, but also as the dominant land power in two vital regions, North America and India. Yet, Britain's coffers were drained by the war's expense. To recoup debts, Parliament imposed new taxation measures on its American colonists, stamp duties, tea taxes, and more, prompting fierce colonial resistance. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. Tensions climaxed in the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when colonists destroyed cargoes of taxed tea. Britain's punitive coercive acts only inflamed dissent, driving 13 colonies toward open rebellion. In 1775, skirmishes at Lexington and Concord ignited the American Revolution. The Continental Congress formed an army under George Washington, marking a transition from protest to war. British forces, accustomed to conventional European engagements, struggled against guerrilla tactics and vast distances. Though they captured New York City and Philadelphia, they were unable to deliver a knockout blow. Meanwhile, American diplomats secured crucial French support after the victory at Saratoga in 1777. Tipping the balance, by 1781, the war reached its turning point at Yorktown. A Franco-American siege trapped General Cornwallis's army, forcing his surrender. Recognizing the futility of further struggle, Britain entered peace negotiations in Paris. Under the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain acknowledged the independence of the United States, relinquishing claims to territory east of the Mississippi River. The loss of the 13 colonies was a bitter blow, demonstration that imperial power could not be maintained by force alone, especially when subjected to Enlightenment-inspired assertions of self-government. Yet, this apparent setback spurred Britain to recalibrate its global strategy. Freed from the fiscal and military burden of North American defense, the Crown turned its attention back to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Reinforced naval squadrons protected Ike interests in India, while new colonies such as New South Wales in Australia, established in 1788, provided penal settlements and raw materials to feed Britain's industrial revolution. In Africa, the founding of Freetown in 1787 by the Sierra Leone Company offered a home for freed slaves and extended British presence along the West African coast. Thus, between 1756 and 1783, Britain transformed its imperial footprint. It seized strategic territories in Canada and India, lost its 13 American colonies, and redirected its energies toward new regions. The empire's recalibration in the war's aftermath set the stage for its Victorian zenith, demonstrating both the fragility of colonial rule and the adaptability that would characterize British power for another century. Continuous webs of sea power, commerce, and settlement would carry Britain forward even as its American chapter closed. The independence of the 13 American colonies forced Britain to shift its imperial focus toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Deprived of the vast eastern seaboard and its profitable tobacco, rice, and timber exports. London redirected political energy and naval resources to regions still offering strategic and economic promise in Asia. The East India Company tightened its grip on Bengal and expanded into the subcontinent's western and southern districts. Politically, the company moved from de facto governor to de jure ruler by the Charter Acts of 1793 and 1813. Parliament increasingly regulated its operations, while the Crown appointed a Governor-General to oversee both commercial and administrative matters, with India's revenues accruing to the royal treasury. Successive Governors General Warren, Hastings, Lord Cornwallis, and Lord Wellesley embarked on campaigns that extended company authority. The Maratha Wars, 1775 to 1818, dismantled a loose confederation of warrior states. In the Anglo-Sikh Wars, 1845 to 1849, brought the fertile Punjab into the Raj. Each conquest was followed by the introduction of British law, administration, and infrastructure courts based on English jurisprudence. Rail lines linking Calcutta to Delhi, and telegraph cables binding Bombay to Madras. As Asia's markets opened to British manufactured goods, from Lancashire textiles to Birmingham, Metalware's India became both supplier of raw materials and consumer of British industry, fueling the empire's economic engine. In Africa, Britain seized opportunities for coastal settlements and naval bases. The cession of Ceylon, Sri Lanka by the Dutch in 1796 provided control of strategic ports near India. Sierra Leone, founded in 1787 as a colony for freed slaves, evolved into a crown colony in 1808, serving both humanitarian and commercial interests. Further south, Cape Town, initially settled by the Dutch in 1650, came under British rule in 1795 and permanently in 1815, becoming a crucial stopover for ships rounding the Cape of Good Hope. From these ports, anti-slavery patrols enforced the 1807 Abolition Act, while explorers like David Livingstone ventured inland, mapping the continent and establishing missionary stations. Setting the stage for the mid-19th century scramble for Africa. Simultaneously, Britain turned its gaze to the Pacific, where the idea of establishing a penal colony took shape. With American ports no longer available and overcrowded jails at home straining the justice system, the government sought a remote alternative. In January 1788, Governor Arthur Phillip led the first Fleet 11 vessels carrying 736 convicts, Marines, and officials from Portsmouth to Botany Bay. On arrival, Phillip quickly determined Botany Bay unsuitable and relocated north to Port Jackson, naming the settlement Sydney Cove. Conditions were austere. Convict labor cleared land for modest agriculture, built rudimentary shelters, and constructed the colony's first wharves. Yet the settlement of Australia offered multiple advantages for the empire. It relieved domestic prisons, established a British presence thousands of miles from European rivals, and opened prospects for wool production, a commodity in growing demand. Within years, free settlers arrived, encouraged by land grants, forming sheep stations that would transform the continent's interior grazing lands. By mid-19th century, the gold rush at Bathurst and Ballarat attracted swarms of migrants, further integrating Australia into the global economy. The shift toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific also reflected broader strategic calculations. Control of Indian Ocean routes secured lines of communication to India and China. Bases in Africa enabled Britain to guard against French expansion. Australia offered a southern anchor and a springboard for Pacific trade. By the early Victorian era, the Royal Navy, strengthened by steam power and coaling stations, patrolled these maritime highways, enforcing Pax Britannica and safeguarding commerce. Thus, the loss of the American colonies marked not an end, but a pivot. London leveraged its remaining possessions and forged new ones to build an empire even more vast and diverse, from the teeming cities of India to the convict farms of New South Wales. Britain's imperial project adapted to changing global dynamics, seeking resources, markets, strategic advantage wherever opportunity presented itself. In doing so, it set the stage for the 19th century's Victorian Zenith, when the sun truly seemed to circle the globe in constant daylight over the British flag. The age of Pax Britannica, Napoleonic Wars, to Victorian Zenith in the spring of 1815, on the rolling fields near Waterloo in present-day Belgium. The forces of Napoleon Bonaparte clashed one final time with a coalition army led by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian Field Marshal Blucher. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo on June 18th ended 2 decades of nearly continuous conflict that had convulsed Europe since the French Revolution. For Britain, victorious but exhausted, it marked the culmination of its emergence as the world's preeminent continental and maritime power. Even before the guns of Waterloo fell silent, Britain had invested heavily in the war effort. The Royal Navy imposed a crippling blockade on French ports, disrupting Napoleon's trade and denying him revenue to fund his armies. On land, British troops, hardened by campaigns in the Peninsular War under Wellington, turned back successive French advances. Financing these campaigns required massive borrowing, the creation of income and property taxes, and the expansion of the Bank of England's note issue, though the cost was immense. British victory preserved the nation's commerce and global influence, with Napoleon exiled to St. Helena. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, convened to redraw Europe's boundaries and establish a balance of power that would prevent another continental conflagration. Britain emerged not only unoccupied, but enriched by its wartime disruptions of French trade and by the capture of valuable French colonies. The overseas empire expanded. Britain secured the Cape Colony from the Dutch, formalized control over Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and solidified its position in the Caribbean. In Asia, the East India Company's territories in India were recognized as essential bulwarks against any future French adventurism. This triumph ushered in the era often termed Pax Britannica, a century-long span in which British naval supremacy and commercial networks enforced a relative peace across the world's oceans. The Royal Navy, already the largest fleet in history, now served as the empire's global police force, protecting maritime trade routes that carried British manufactured goods to every quarter of the globe and returned with raw materials, fueling the Industrial Revolution powered by coal, steam, and mechanized factories of Lancashire and the Midlands, unlike the conscripted armies of continental powers. The Royal Navy relied on a professional cadre of officers and a volunteer seafaring population drawn from Britain's ports. Ships of the line, huge wooden warships bristling with dozens of cannons could project power to distant anchorages, from the Cape of Good Hope to the Straits of Malacca. In peacetime, these vessels undertook anti-piracy patrols in the South China Sea, escorted convoys through the Mediterranean, and enforced British trade terms in Southeast Asia. Smaller sloops and frigates charted unrecorded islands in the Pacific, laid telegraph cables on the seafloor, and supported British consulates in treaty ports like Shanghai and Yokohama. Perhaps the Navy's most celebrated peacetime mission was the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade. After Parliament's Slave Trade Act of 1807 made the trade illegal, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron was established in 1808. Stationed off the African coast, its ships intercepted hundreds of slaving vessels, liberating tens of thousands of enslaved Africans, though tragic losses still occurred from disease, crowding, and the perils of the sea. This naval policing underscored Britain's self-image as a crusading force for humanitarian improvement, even as its empire continued to rely on indentured and exploited labor in sugar plantations and mines. Naval bases at Gibraltar, Malta, Ceylon, and Singapore became linchpins in the Imperial network, offering coaling stations for the new steam frigates and havens for repairs. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 though not under British control, further shortened the sea lanes to India and East Asia, magnifying the Royal Navy's ability to respond swiftly to crises, whether a rebellion in Zanzibar, a mutiny in Canton, or a dispute over colonial borders in Africa. Under Queen Victoria's long reign, 1837 to 1901, British prestige reached its zenith. The Queen's photograph appeared alongside colonial governors' dispatches. Her name adorned ships, forts, and entire cities from Victoria in Canada to Port Victoria in Seychelles. London hosted the Great Exhibition of 1851, showcasing technological marvels from around the Empire: steam engines, telegraph instruments, and specimens from Australian, celebrating industrial progress under British auspices. Yet Pax Britannica was neither absolute nor unchallenged. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, exposed deficiencies in army logistics and hospital care, prompting reforms that modernized the army. Union victories in the American Civil War demonstrated that emerging powers could field well-armed, industrialized armies. Meanwhile, Germany's unification under Prussia and the rise of the German High Seas Fleet in the late 19th century foreshadowed new maritime competition. Still, throughout this era, the Royal Navy remained the Empire's guarantee of security and stability. Merchant vessels, some 30,000 by mid-century, traversed global routes with confidence, assured under Lloyd's of London, while colonial administrators enforced treaties backed by overwhelming naval firepower. British subjects everywhere from Bombay to Barbados looked to the white ensign as a promise of safe harbor and unimpeded trade. Thus, between 1815 and the dawn of the 20th century, Britain leveraged the defeat of Napoleon into an unparalleled system of global influence. By combining naval dominance with commercial expansion, it sustained a world order in which British ideas of free trade, the gold standard, and parliamentary government circulated alongside tea, cotton, and coal. This Pax Britannica, however, laid the foundations for both the empire's final consolidation and the force's nationalism, industrialization, and rival alliances that would eventually challenge British supremacy in the 20th century, following the defeat of Napoleon and the consolidation of Britain's naval dominance. The 19th century saw an expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, unrolled like a map of dominion. In Africa, the British flag was raised over the Cape Colony in 1815, securing a key calling station for ships steaming between Europe and India. Throughout the century, successive treaties, often negotiated under duress or enforced by gunboat, diplomacy extended control along the west coast, the Gambia in 1821, Gold Coast in 1824, and East Coast Aden in 1839. By the 1850s, forts and trading posts dotted the Nigerian coastline, laying the groundwork for formal protectorates. Missionaries and explorers, David Livingstone most famously, penetrated further inland, opening up the heart of the continent, even as he inadvertently paved the way for the later scramble for Africa. In Asia, Britain's empire continued to cement its hold. After the East India Company's victory in Burma, 1826, the First and Second Opium Wars in China, 1839 to 1842, 1856 to 1860, forced open Chinese ports to British trade and ceded Hong Kong as a crown colony in 1842. The Malay Peninsula saw the settlement of Penang, 1786, and Singapore, 1819, both of which thrived as intrepids for Chinese and Indian migrants. Treaty ports along the Yangtze, Shanghai, Canton, and others became hubs of foreign commerce, linked to London by regular steamship lines and the burgeoning network of the overland route through Suez across the Pacific. New lands fell under British control. Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, had been colonized in 1803. By 1824, Western Australia was claimed, followed by South Australia, 1836, and Queensland, 1859. The federation of these 6 colonies, as the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, represented the maturing of settler societies into self-governing dominions within the empire. In New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, between the Crown and Inbori chiefs established British sovereignty. Though subsequent conflicts, known as the New Zealand Wars, revealed tensions over land and governance. This territorial growth was mirrored by a domestic Victorian Britain that underwent its own metamorphosis. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the late 18th century, reached full force under Queen Victoria. Steam engines powered factories in Manchester and Birmingham. Coalfields in South Wales and Yorkshire supplied energy. Ironworks in Sheffield and Gateshead forged rails and machinery. By mid-century, Britain produced nearly half of the world's manufactured goods, from cotton textiles to steam locomotives. The railway age emerged as one of the century's most transformative developments. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in 1825, followed by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, the world's first intercity passenger line. Rail tracks grew into a vast network. By 1850, over 6,000 miles of track crisscrossed the British Isles, linking industrial centers to ports and markets. Railways not only revolutionized domestic transport, shrinking travel times and encouraging urbanization, but also inspired colonial rail projects in India, Africa, and Australia. The East India Railway reached Delhi by 1864, while the Uganda Railway, 1896 to 1901, carved a line from Mombasa to Lake Victoria, facilitating trade and troop movements in East Africa to administer this sprawling empire. The British government and the East India Company developed complex colonial administrations. In India, the Indian Civil Service, recruited through competitive exams from the 1850s, oversaw revenue collection, law and order, and public works. District collectors wielded immense power, adjudicating disputes and implementing infrastructure projects, roads, canals, notably the Ganges Canal of the 1840s, and telegraph lines. In African colonies, colonial secretariats managed land grants, labor laws, and local treaties. In settler colonies, like Canada and Australia, legislatures composed of elected representatives worked alongside governors appointed by Whitehall, gradually extending self-government under the principle of responsible ministry. Public health and education also became imperial priorities. In British India, vaccination campaigns against smallpox began in the 1820s, while public works engineer Lord Dalhousie, Governor-General, 1848 to 1856, promoted roads and railways to facilitate resource extraction and troop movements. Missionary schools opened across Africa and the Pacific, teaching English, reading, vocational skills, often with an aim to inculcate British cultural values alongside literacy. By the Victorian Zenith, the second half of the 19th century, Britain's imperial enterprise was sustained by a synergy of military strength, industrial capacity, and administrative organization. The Royal Navy patrolled sea lanes, trains, and telegraphs knitted together vast territories. Civil servants and planters managed economies ranging from rice paddies in Burma to diamond mines in South Africa. The sun literally never set on these possessions. Its military garrisons and colonial capitals glowed beneath every time zone. Yet, beneath the veneer of stability, lay tensions, native resistance in India culminating in the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion, African uprisings against land seizures, and settler Aboriginal conflicts in Australia. The same railways that connected markets also facilitated troop deployments to quash revolts. Britain's empire, while expansive and prosperous, faced challenges that foreshadowed the political and social upheavals of the 20th century. Still, during the Pax Britannica, the empire appeared as a remarkable integration of industrial modernity and global ambition. Victorian Britain stood as an exemplar of technological innovation, confident governance, and moral mission even as it navigated the contradictions inherent in ruling diverse peoples across continents. This era set enduring patterns of global trade, legal systems, and cultural exchange foundations upon which the modern world would be built. India, Jewel of the Crown, the year 1857, marked a watershed in Britain's relationship with its most prized possession, India, commonly called the Sepoy Rebellion or the Indian Mutiny. The uprising began among Indian soldiers, sepoys in the East India Company's army, Admirat, spreading rapidly to Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and beyond. It united soldiers, dispossessed landlords, and peasants under both local leaders and deposed Mughal princes in a broad, if fractured, revolt against company rule. Its causes were complex: resentment over low pay, racial discrimination by British officers, cultural offenses, most notoriously the introduction of rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities. For over a year, battles raged across northern and central India's company forces and, after 1858, the British Crown's troops suppressed the insurrection with equal measures of military force and administrative overhaul. At Kanpur, Lucknow, and Delhi, sieges ended in brutal reprisals and the reestablishment of company authority. When Delhi itself fell in September 1857, the aging Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was deposed and exiled to Rangoon, symbolically ending the Mughal line and consolidating British supremacy. In the rebellion's aftermath, British policymakers recognized that the East India Company's structure, driven primarily by profit, lacking accountability, and staffed by officers more interested in trade than governance, was inadequate for ruling a subcontinent of several hundred million. The Government of India Act of 1858 abolished company rule, transferring all administrative powers, revenues, and armed forces directly to the Crown. The new office of Viceroy and Governor-General of India, Kent, united the roles of Company Governor-General and the Queen's representative, answering to the Secretary of State for India in London, and guided by a newly formed India Council of experienced administrators. Under the British Raj, governance became more centralized and bureaucratic. The Indian Civil Service, ICS, its officers recruited through open examinations held in London and Minister districts, collected land revenue, and adjudicated disputes in courts modeled on British law. Railways and telegraph lines expanded at breakneck speed during the mid-19th century, now served dual functions, facilitating troop movements to deter local unrest and integrating distant provinces into a single economic zone. Between 1857 and 1900, India's railway network grew from a few hundred miles to over 20,000 miles of track, carrying cotton, grain, and tea to ports for export, and distributing British manufactured goods back inland. Economically, the Raj emphasized cash crops, tea in Assam and Darjeeling, indigo in Bihar, cotton in Gujaratafan, at the expense of food grains. Recurrent famines no more devastating than the Great Famine of 1876 to 78, which claimed up to 6 million lives, prompted the Raj to establish famine relief systems and irrigation works. Though critics argued that relief arrived too late and was inadequate, public health measures, such as cholera inquiries and the creation of railway hospitals, slowly improved mortality rates in urban centers. British missionaries and philanthropists set up hospitals and schools, often with the goal of converting Indians to Christianity in this period of consolidation and modernization. The British Crown sought to bind India more closely to the monarchy itself. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title Empress of India's symbolic act, proclaimed by royal proclamation on January 1st at a grand levee at Windsor Castle. The title carried deep significance. It emphasized imperial unity, countered any notion that India remained merely the company's patrimony, and linked the monarchy's prestige directly to India's destiny. A lavish Delhi Durbar in 1877 and Imperial court assembled at the site of the old Mughal throne crowded onto its marble terraces, a display of princes, British generals, and thousands of troops, all bearing witness to Victoria's new role. Though the Queen herself never visited India, The annual Durbar ceremonies under her successors became focal points for imperial loyalty and pageantry. Victoria's assumption of the Empress title and the Raj's administrative reforms exemplified the paradox of the Indian relationship. It was an empire ruled in the name of liberal ideals, rule of law, representative assemblies in some provinces, and Western education, yet fundamentally sustained by military power, racial hierarchy, and economic exploitation. Indians educated in British institutions began to apply Western political concepts to Indian conditions, giving rise to early nationalist associations in the 1880s that would later coalesce into the Indian National Congress. By the late 19th century, India had become the literal and figurative jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Its resources underwrote Britain's industrial economy. Its armies supplemented imperial forces abroad, and its tea, cotton, and jute symbolized a vast global network. Yet, beneath the veneer of imperial progress lay the tensions of cultural dislocation and the stirrings of political self-assertion that would, in the 20th century, lead to demands for self-rule and the eventual dissolution of the empire it had underpinned. The economic impact of British rule in India was profound and far-reaching, shaping the subcontinent's infrastructure, agricultural patterns, and demographics, upping with unintended and tragic consequences. Foremost among these transformations was the construction of railways, an enterprise undertaken by the Raj to bind its vast territories together. Beginning with the inaugural line between Bombay and Tana in 1853, the network expanded at breakneck speed. By 1870, over 13,000 miles of track linked Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. By 1900, there were nearly 26,000 miles crisscrossing the plains, its plateau, and hills. These steel arteries served multiple colonial objectives. They allowed rapid troop movements to quell rebellions and enforce law and order. They facilitated the flow of raw materials, jute from Bengal, cotton from Gujarat, tea from Asantu ports for export to Manchester's mills, and they carried British manufactured goods back into India's interior markets. The railways also stimulated related industries, ironworks in Bengal, coal mining in Raniganj, and port expansions in Karachi and Madras. Yet this infrastructure came at a cost. Indian taxpayers, via land revenues, financed much of the construction of Fen under duress, while Indian laborers worked under hazardous conditions, paid a fraction of European wages, and sometimes perished in large numbers building embankments and tunnels parallel to rail expansion. British agrarian policy emphasized cash crops to fuel international trade. Land revenue assessments shifted from traditional crops rice, millet, pulses, to cotton, indigo, opium, and tea. The riotory and zamindari systems compelled cultivators and landlords to pay fixed revenues to the state, regardless of harvest fluctuations. In good years, planters profited handsomely. In bad years, peasants sank into debt, forfeited land, faced punitive tax collector interventions. These policies had devastating human consequences during times of climatic stress. India endured a series of catastrophic famines in the late 19th century in 1866, 1876 to 78, and 1896 to 97, among the worst, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 16 to 29 million people. Contemporary British officials often attributed famine to natural causes and resisted extensive relief measures, fearing that state handouts would undermine self-reliance and burden the treasury. When relief was provided through work projects such as canal digging or relief kitchens, it was often too late and too limited. Critics like Dadabhai Naoroji decried the drain of wealth from India to Britain, arguing that the export of Indian grain and the extraction of revenue for imperial projects exacerbated food shortages. Beneath these economic currents lay the cultural and religious dynamics of British rule, which reshaped Indian society in both overt and subtle ways. Christian missionaries, booed by many, at first founded schools and hospitals, translating the Bible into Tamil, Hindi, and Bengali, while teaching English literacy and Western sciences. Missionary education produced a small but influential class of English-educated Indians who became lawyers, journalists, and civil servants. Figures such as Raja, Ram, Mohan, Roy, and Jodharao Phule used their command of English and exposure to Enlightenment ideas to campaign against sati and caste discrimination, while advocating for widow remarriage and women's education at the same time. British officials enacted social reforms that often reflected Victorian moral sensibilities more than Indian realities. The age of consent at 1891 raised the legal marriage age for girls. The Vernacular Press Act 1878 censored Indian newspapers deemed seditious, and the Criminal Tribes Act 1871 branded certain nomadic communities as criminal by birth. These interventions both challenged and sometimes strengthened traditional religious practices. While some Hindu and Muslim elites welcomed bans on sati and protection of widow rights, conservative religious leaders saw them as threats to their authority and cultural autonomy. Religion itself became a sphere of negotiation and conflict. The Raj recognized multiple faith communities through the 1893 Ilbert Bill controversy and the later introduction of separate electorates for Muslims in 1909. These measures tended to manage diversity, also institutionalized communal identities, and fostered the beginnings of political separatism. Festivals like Durga, Puja, and Eid continued to unite communities, but the shared spaces of pre-colonial urban life markets, pilgrimage routes, vocational institutions gradually became demarcated along religious lines. Cultural fusion occurred in parallel. Indian elites adopted British dress for official functions, while British administrators in Calcutta and Simla joined boat races on the Hooghly and picnics in the Himalayas. English became the language of administration and aspiration, birthing a vibrant colonial literature. Bankim, Chandra Chatterjee, and Munshi Premchand among its pioneers, who wrote in Bengali and Hindi respectively, but drew on Western narrative forms. Indian architects blended Gothic and Mughal styles in buildings like the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta, symbolizing the hybrid identity of Imperial India. Thus, the economic developments of railways and cash crop cultivation under the Raj were inseparable from the cultural and religious transformations wrought by British rule. They facilitated commerce and control, but also fueled social dislocation and fostered elite consciousness. Education, law, and public health reforms reflected Victorian ideals, even as they intersected with Indian traditions to create a new, complex colonial society, one that would increasingly assert its own voice and ultimately seek self-determination in the decades to come. Africa carved up the scramble and resistance by the late 19th century. The European powers' appetite for overseas territory had transformed Africa from a continent of vibrant kingdoms and societies to a patchwork of colonial possessions, driven by competition for resources, strategic advantage, and national prestige. The scramble for Africa was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, convened by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany. This meeting of 14 European states sought to impose order on the frenetic claims of explorers, missionaries, and trading companies. The Berlin Conference did not include any African representatives. Decisions over millions of square miles were made in European halls. Commissioners mapped out spheres of influence, codifying rules, effective occupation through treaties with local rulers. Establishment of administration and policing became the criterion for legal claim. The Congo Basin fell under King Leopold II of Belgium's personal rule, the Congo Free State, while France secured West African territories stretching from Senegal to Chad. Britain laid claim to a continuous line from Cairo to Cape Town, envisaging a red line of rail and telegraph linking its colonies, and Portugal extended its coastal outposts in Angola and Mozambique. By 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained formally independent. Britain's African empire thus expanded dramatically. In West Africa, British Nigeria took shape through the merging of the Lagos colony and the Niger Coast Protectorate. East Africa became British East Africa, Kenya, while Egypt, already a de jure Ottoman province, was effectively controlled by Britain after 1882 to secure the Suez Canal, a vital artery to India. The Cape Colony and Natal, long under British governance, would soon be joined to two Boer republics, Transvaal and the Orange Free State, following inclusion of those territories after the Anglo-Africana conflicts. Indeed, the Boer Wars in South Africa, 1882, 81, and 1899 to 1902, epitomized both the rivalry between settler societies and the harsh realities of imperial conquest. The first war erupted in 1880 when the Boer settlers of the Transvaal, descendants of Dutch and Huguenot pioneers, rebelled against British annexation in 1877. Though outnumbered, Boer commandos, mounted riflemen, adept at hit-and-run tactics, defeated British regulars at battles such as Majuba Hill, forcing a British withdrawal and recognition of Transvaal self-government under a nominal British suzerainty. Tensions resumed with the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886, which drew a flood of Uitlanders, foreigners, largely British, into the Transvaal. The Boer government restricted voting rights, fueling demands for franchise and attacks on Boer sovereignty. When diplomacy failed, war broke out again in 1899. The Second Boer War pitted some 40,000 professional British troops from across the empire against 60,000 Boer commandos. Initial British reverses at Spion Kop and Colonso underscored the Boer skill with Mauser rifles and intimate knowledge of the VELD. In response, Britain adopted a scorched earth campaign under Lord Kitchener, burning farms, destroying crops, and interning Boer civilians, men, women, and children in concentration camps. The appalling conditions in these camps led to high mortality rates from malnutrition and disease, galvanizing humanitarian criticism back home. Nevertheless, the British eventual siege of Boer strongholds, Bloemfontein and Pretoria, and the capture of Boer military leadership forced peace negotiations. The Treaty of Vereeniging in May 1902 ended the conflict, bringing the two Boer republics under British sovereignty. In exchange for amnesty and the promise of eventual self-government, the Boers accepted British rule. The consolidation of the Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal, and Orange River Colony paved the way for the Union of South Africa in 1910. Dominion within the British Empire. The scramble for Africa and the Boer Wars illustrate the era's defining tensions. European powers carving up a continent without regard for indigenous boundaries, settler communities asserting their own rights, and the brutal methods used to impose control. Yet resistance did not end with these events. Across West and East Africa, local kingdoms Ashanti in modern Ghana, Zulu, and Natal, the Maida state in Sudan would challenge colonial authority in revolts and guerrilla campaigns well into the 20th century. These struggles underscored that, even amid the imperial high tide of Pax Britannica, the subjugation of Africa remained contested terrain, as prelude to the continent's eventual liberation movements. In the closing decades of the 19th century, Britain secured its strategic lifelines in Africa by establishing a protectorate over Egypt and seizing control of the Suez Canal, while indigenous polities across the continent mounted determined resistance from the Zulu in the south to the Ashanti in West Africa to the Maida state in the Sudan. Egyptian protectorate and control of the Suez Canal, opened in 1869, linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and cut the voyage to India by nearly 4,000 miles. Though engineered by the French entrepreneur Ferdinand de Lesseps. It soon attracted British interest. In 1875, fearing French and Ottoman influence, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli authorized the purchase of 44% of the canal's shares from Egypt's indebted ruler, Khedive Ismail Pasha. This strategic investment gave Britain significant sway over canal operations. By 1882, financial crisis and nationalist unrest in Egypt, the Yoruba revolt, led by Colonel Ahmed Yoruba, prompted Britain to intervene militarily under the pretext of protecting European lives and canal traffic. A swift naval bombardment of Alexandria and victory at the Battle of Tel El-Kebir installed a pro-British government in Cairo, though nominally still under Ottoman suzerainty. Egypt, henceforth, functioned as a British protectorate with a resident British consul general wielding real power over fiscal, military, and foreign affairs. Under British administration, the canal security became paramount. Fortifications and garrisons were established along its length. Customs revenues funded public works, including irrigation schemes that expanded cotton cultivation in the Nile Valley. Nonetheless, British rule in Egypt provoked local resentment. Peasants and urban elites found their autonomy curtailed by administrators who often overlooked Egyptian concerns for the sake of imperial commerce. Resistance, Zulu, Ashanti, and Sudanese modest despite Britain's technological and military advantages. African states with strong martial traditions resisted colonial penetration. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo remained independent until Britain's annexation of the Boer republics brought colonial forces to its doorstep. Tensions over land and British support for rival tribes erupted in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. At the Battle of Isandlwana, Zulu MP's war regiments annihilated a British column equipped with Martini Henry rifles, inflicting one of the Empire's worst defeats. Yet, the war's second phase saw the British adapt, employing better use of entrenched positions and bringing reinforcements. Cetshwayo's capital at Ulandi fell, and though the Zulu retained some autonomy, the kingdom was effectively broken into smaller chiefdoms under British oversight. Further west, Ashanti Empire in modern Ghana had successfully repelled early 19th century British incursions. By the 1870s, Ashanti refusal to acknowledge British suzerainty over coastal Fant states led to the Third Anglo-Ashanti War 1873–74. British forces, leveraging newer breech-loading rifles and naval gunboats on the Prie and Volta rivers, captured the Ashanti capital of Kumasi. A peace treaty imposed indemnities, but a full annexation would await a final war in 1900. When the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War crushed a local rebellion and integrated the territory into the Gold Coast colony in the northeastern Sahara, the collapse of Ottoman Egyptian control during the Mahdi uprising opened a vast theater of resistance. Muhammad al-Mahdi, a Sufi cleric who declared himself the Mahdi, the divinely guided, one united disparate Sudanese tribes in revolt from 1881. His forces overran Khartoum in 1885, killing General Charles Gordon and establishing the Mahdi state. For 13 years, the Khalifa Abdullahi al-Tashi governed an independent theocracy, challenging both Egyptian and British authority. Britain, determined to reopen access to the Upper Nile and protect its route to Khartoum and beyond, to Uganda and the East Africa Protectorate, organized a reconquest under General Herbert Kitchener, with a modern army equipped with Maxim machine guns, river steamers, and rail supply lines. British-Egyptian forces marched southward, crushing modest defenders at Omdurman in 1898. Kitchener's army inflicted staggering casualties, over 10,000 Sudanese dead to under 500. Anglo-Egyptian losses, underscoring the lethal gap created by rapid-fire weapons and coordinated logistics. These uprisings, Zulu, Ashanti, modest reveal a pattern of valiant resistance met by overwhelming imperial force. Yet they also illustrate the limits of colonial power when confronted by unified indigenous armies leveraging knowledge of terrain and traditional tactics. Though ultimately suppressed, these movements delayed British consolidation, imposed heavy costs on the empire, and forged legacies of resilience that would inspire anti-colonial struggles in the 20th century. By the turn of the century, Britain had carved nearly the entire African continent into colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence. However, the African Dark Continent had not been an empty canvas. It was a tapestry of powerful states and societies. Zulu, Ashanti, modest, contested imperial ambitions. Their resistance compelled the empire to adapt its military tactics, administrative policies, and sometimes its rhetoric of moral mission, foreshadowing the waning of imperial legitimacy in the decades to come. Commerce and culture. The imperial network. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had matured into a vast imperial network, not just a collection of colonies, protectorates, and dominions, but an integrated system of communication, transportation, and cultural exchange. Two technological innovations lay at its heart: undersea telegraph cables and steamships, which together outpaced every rival in speed and reliability. At the same time, a plethora of missionaries and educational institutions transmitted British, religious, linguistic, and moral values across the globe, weaving a cultural fabric that supported imperial cohesion. Telegraph cables, steamships, and global trade flows. Prior to 1850, messages between London and India took weeks by ship around the Cape of Good Hope. The laying of the first successful Atlantic telegraph cable in 1866 connecting Britain to Newfoundland heralded the age of instant communication. Soon cables linked Gibraltar, Malta, Bombay, and Singapore, creating a global telegraph network that shrank political and commercial distances. By 1902, Cape Town connected to Bombay, then Hong Kong, and finally Vancouver via the Pacific Cable. Near instantaneous messages enabled the Colonial Office in Whitehall to direct troops in Egypt, relay dispatches from Calcutta, and inform stock exchanges in Bombay of price changes in London. Complementing telegraph lines. Steamships revolutionized maritime travel. The shift from sail to steam began in the 1830s with paddle wheelers like the SS Great Western. By the 1870s, iron-hulled screw steamers such as the SS City of Rome and RMSP and O-lines dominated passenger and mail service. Steam reduced voyage times. London to Bombay fell from 6 months under sail to 6 weeks by steam. Mail steamers carrying the imperial mail plied fixed schedules, assured of coaling stations at Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Bombay, Penang, Singapore, Hong Kong. These blue funnel lines transported not only letters, but also perishable goods, fresh fruit from Australia, tea from Ceylon, meat in refrigerated holds from New Zealand, feeding Britain's urban masses and binding its colonial economies to metropolitan markets. Such connectivity underpinned burgeoning global trade flows. British manufacturers exported cotton textiles, steel rails, and machinery to every continent and returned with raw materials: Indian tea and jute, African gold and ivory, Australian wool, Canadian wheat, and Caribbean sugar. Cargoes moved on. A triangular trade model: manufactured goods from Britain to colonies, colonial exports to Britain, occasional intercolonial trade: jute from Bengal to East Africa, Canadian lumber to India. Expanded markets and deepened economic interdependence. Freight rates, insurance premiums, and shipping schedules, all negotiated in London, shaped the fortunes of colonial planters, merchants, and peasant producers alike. Missionaries and educational institutions behind the arteries of commerce ran the cultural streams of Christian missionary societies. Search Missionary Society, CMS, founded in 1799, and the London Missionary Society, LMS, founded in 1795, dispatched thousands of missionaries to India, Africa, the Pacific Islands. In China, they set up mission stations, often near colonial centers Calcutta, Nairobi. Auckland Dan traveled into the interior to evangelize local populations. Missionaries learned indigenous languages, produced grammars and dictionaries, and translated the Bible into hundreds of tongues: Bengali, Swahili, Mbori, Tamil, and dozens more. While their primary aim was religious conversion, mission schools also taught reading, arithmetic, and British history, producing an educated elite who sometimes became intermediaries between colonial authorities and indigenous communities. The colonial state and missionary societies often cooperated in establishing educational institutions, modeled on British public schools and universities. In India, the Macaulay Minute of 1835 had set English, rather than Sanskrit or Arabic, as the language of higher education. This led to the founding of universities in Calcutta, 1857, Bombay, 1857, Ain Madras, 1857, patterned after the University of London, with curricula in law, science, and humanities taught by British professors. In Africa, mission schools preceded government-run institutions. Fourabay College in Sierra Leone, founded 1827, became a center for West African clergy and administrators. In the Caribbean, the Cotterington College in Barbados, 1710, trained Anglican clergymen for service across the Leeward Islands. Elsewhere, institutions such as Macharia College in Uganda, founded 1922 as a technical school, and University College of Fort Hare in South Africa, 1916, educated future African leaders. In Australia and New Zealand, Colonial Colleges University of Sydney, 1850, University of Melbourne, 1853, University of Otago, 1869, served settler populations, producing lawyers, doctors, and civil servants who would run Dominion governments. In later decades, while these schools and universities instilled British values, parliamentary government, scientific rationalism, Shakespeare, they also became crucibles for anti-colonial thought. Alumni such as Gandhi University College London, Nehru Trinity College, Cambridge, Nkrumah, Lincoln University, USA, and Jomo Kenyatta London School of Economics adapted Western political ideas to their own struggles, eventually leading movements for independence and combining technological networks, telegraph, steam with cultural networks, missionaries, and education. The British Empire created a remarkable integration of diverse territories, commerce-bound colonies to the metropole, while schools and churches disseminated imperial ideologies and fostered local elites who managed colonial rule and later negotiated its end. Yet, these same networks also carried the seeds of decolonization. As global communication accelerated the spread of nationalist ideas and missionary-educated leaders challenged the very authority that had shaped them. In this sense, the imperial network was both the engine of British global supremacy and a lattice along which the empire's eventual unraveling would travel beyond the cables. Steamships. Britain's empire solidified its reach through the export of legal, educational, and linguistic systems. Courts modeled on English common law. Schools patterned after Victorian grammar institutions, and the spread of the English language created a shared framework of norms and communication that persists across former colonies. British legal influence. One of the most enduring legacies of the empire is the transplantation of common law. From courtrooms in Mumbai to those in Nairobi, judges learned to apply principles first articulated in Westminster Hall: the rule of precedent, trial by jury, and protections against arbitrary arrest. In India, the Indian Penal Code of 1860, drafted under Lord Macaulay and Sir James Stephen, standardized criminal law across vast and diverse provinces, replacing a patchwork of Mughal-era regulations. In West Africa, the Gold Coast's native jurisdiction Ordinance of 1878 recognized customary laws. Under the supervision of colonial magistrates, Legal codification also extended to commercial disputes. The Indian Contract Act 1872 and the Indian Evidence Act 1872 defined property rights, commercial obligations, and rules of evidence for Indian courts, enabling British merchants and the East India Company to operate under familiar legal structures. In Canada and Australia, provincial and state legislatures passed local statutes, but their language and logic mirrored those of Westminster, allowing lawyers trained in London to serve seamlessly across the empire. Educational systems, Seducation, became a conduit for British curricula and administration. Colonial India, the Minto-Morley Reforms, 1909, expanded Indian representation but kept English medium colleges at the heart of higher learning. Schools followed the Indian Education Department regulations, requiring proficiency in English grammar, arithmetic, and British history. Similarly, in Africa, missionary and government schools used the Cape Colony syllabus, Latin, mathematics, and Bible studies alongside local languages. Local elites, nabobs in India, EGAs in Nigeria, Eurasians in Burma sent their children to these institutions, hoping to secure positions within the colonial civil service or the pipeline of the Indian civil service. Scholarships, like the Rhodes Scholarship, established in 1902, brought young men from Australia, Canada, South Africa, and the United States to Oxford University, further entwining colonial elites with British academic traditions. Linguistic influences. English became the language of government, trade, and education. It also became the medium for newspapers, novels, and plays that circulated throughout the empire. Newspapers, like the Times of India, 1838, and the Natal Mercury, 1852, mirrored their London counterpart in style and content, discussing parliamentary debates and global markets alongside local news. In Africa, the Nigerian Pioneer and African Morning Post provided forums for political discussion in English, while in the Caribbean, the Gleaner, Jamaica, 1834 shaped public opinion on colonial reforms and emancipation. By the early 20th century, English language publishers in Bombay, Calcutta, and Cape Town produced textbooks, legal digests, and dictionaries used across the empire. English became a lingua franca connecting administrators, merchants, and educated locals, even as regional languages Hindi, Yoruba, Malay continued to thrive in everyday life. Tea, cricket, and Britishness as global exports, cultural symbols, accompanied legal and linguistic exports, most notably tea and cricket, which came to embody Britishness abroad. Tea, introduced into India by the East India Company in the 1830s, became a national obsession. Tea gardens in Assam and Darjeeling produced black tea that was blended, packed, and exported in vast quantities to Britain. Afternoon tea, which was once a domestic novelty in London parlors, spread to India's hill stations of Shimla and UTE, where British officials and Indian elites gathered for scones, samosas, and socializing under parasols. Tea also became central to Asian social life. In Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the government promoted tea estates as the backbone of the colony's economy, while in Africa, tea plantations in Kenya and Malawi supplied the global market. Cricket followed. Similarly, brought to India by British officers in the 18th century, the game was embraced by local schools and princely courts. The Parsis of Bombay formed the first Indian cricket club in 1848. By the late 19th century, Indian teams composed of Hindus, Muslims, and Christians competed against visiting MCC Marylebone Cricket Club sides. The intercolonial championship between Bombay, Madras, Calcutta fostered regional patriotism within the Imperial framework. In the Caribbean, cricket grounds in Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica became arenas for demonstrating prowess and asserting identity among Afro-Caribbean populations. Similarly, in East Africa, the game spread among South Asian immigrant communities in Nairobi and Mombasa, eventually drawing African players into the fold. Tours by English teams to Australia, South Africa, and the West Indies reinforced cricket's power to bind distant societies in a common sport emblematic of fair play, gentlemanly conduct, and imperial solidarity. Beyond tea and cricket, the trappings of Britishness from the red telephone box and double-decker bus to the institution of the Royal Engineers Canal and bridge designs adapted to local contexts. Government buildings in Delhi and Sydney reflected neoclassical styles seen in Whitehall. Public parks in Lagos and Perth bore the names of Victoria, Albert, and Wellington. Anglican cathedrals, St. George's in Malta, St. Paul's in Calcutta dominated city skylines. This export of legal, educational, linguistic, and cultural institutions underpinned the empire's cohesion. Yet, it also cultivated local variations and hybrid identities. While colonial subjects adopted English manners and sports, they infused them with indigenous creativity, resulting in tea rituals with samosa accompaniments, cricket matches under tropical skies, and legal arguments drawing on both English precedent and customary law. Thus, the imperial network functioned not as a monolith, but as a dynamic exchange where British systems exported overseas could be reinterpreted and indigenized. These cross-cultural flows sustained British global influence, even as they sowed seeds of local agency and the eventual movements for self-governance that would transform the empire in the 20th century. The two world wars. Empire at war when Europe plunged into conflict in August 1914. The British Empire immediately mobilized its vast resources, manpower, materiel, and economic strength spread from London to the dominions and colonies. More than a quarter of the world's English-speaking population answered the call, demonstrating both imperial solidarity and local aspirations for recognition. From Canada to Australia, New Zealand to South Africa, and across India and Africa, men of volunteers marched off to distant battlefields, reshaping the meaning of loyalty and citizenship within the imperial framework. Dominions and colonies in WWIAN, Canada, Prime Minister Robert Borden swiftly committed the Canadian Expeditionary Force CEF to Europe. By war's end, nearly 620,000 Canadians had served around a quarter of the population, and 60,000 lay dead. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917 became a nation-forming moment when 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time, capturing a formidable German position through meticulous planning and creeping barrages. Canada's sacrifices earned it a separate signature on the Treaty of Versailles, marking its emergence as a self-governing actor within the empire. Thousands more troops came from Australia and New Zealand. Anzac troops landed at Gallipoli in April 1915, conceived as a means to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The Dardanelles campaign aimed to secure a sea route to Russia. Instead, rugged terrain, fierce Turkish defense under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and inadequate planning turned Gallipoli into a stalemate. Over 8 months, Anzacs and British troops endured harsh conditions, sea disease, and relentless shelling before evacuation in December 1915. Though a military failure, the campaign galvanized national consciousness in both dominions. Anzac Day, April 25th, remains a solemn commemoration of sacrifice. Newfoundland, then still a British colony, contributed the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, which suffered catastrophic losses at Beaumont Hamel on July 1, 1916, the first day of the Somme offensive. Of its 780 men, only 68 answered roll call the next morning. A tragedy seared into Newfoundland's collective memory and influencing its later confederation. With Canada in 1949. In South Africa, men of various backgrounds, Afrikaner, African, colored enlisted in the South African Overseas Expeditionary Force. They fought in German, Southwest Africa, Namibia, on the Western Front, although apartheid ideology would later fracture the Dominion's unity. WWI momentarily aligned competing communities under a single war effort across British India. Over 1 million soldiers and laborers served. Indian troops formed divisions in Mesopotamia, East Africa, the Western Front, and the Sinai-Palestine theater. The Gurkhas from Nepal and Punjabi regiments gained renown for their toughness, while Indian troops fought bravely, winning Victoria Crosses for gallantry. They did so under British officers, fueling post-war demands for self-government and sowing the seeds of nationalist agitation. African colonies also supplied manpower. The West Africa Frontier Force and East Africa Expeditionary Force battled the German colonial armies in Togoland, Cameroon, and German East Africa Tanganyika. In 1914-16 Cameroon campaign, British, French, and Belgian forces overran German forts. In East Africa, General Paul von Lettower-Beck's guerrilla campaign tied down Allied troops for 4 years, culminating in his formal surrender only after the armistice. These campaigns illustrated Africa's strategic importance and the complexities of colonial warfare. Logistics over vast, undeveloped terrain, reliance on portages, and encounters among European, African, and Indian troops under the Union Jack Gallipoli, Middle Eastern campaigns, and African fronts, Jack Gallipoli. The Allies faced steep cliffs at Anzac Cove and narrow beaches under constant Turkish observation. Landings on April 25th met immediate resistance. Trenches carved into limestone ridges became killing zones. The Allies attempted offensives. Satatark's 57th Regiment resisted fiercely, but by January 1916, evacuations ended hopes for a breakthrough. Gallipoli unified Turkish nationalism under Ataturk's leadership would reshape modern Turkey. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Sinai and Palestine campaign opened in 1916, with British and Anzac forces defending the Suez Canal against Ottoman raids. General Edmund Allenby's eventual capture of Beersheba, Jerusalem, and Damascus in 1917-18 dismantled Ottoman rule. These victories relied on coordination of cavalry, infantry, and newly mechanized elements like armored cars, innovations that reflected the empire's adaptability in Mesopotamia. The British Indian Army sought to secure oil fields at Basra and protect Persian Gulf shipping lanes. Initial successes in 1914 led to overextension, culminating in the Siege of Guadalajara, 1915-16, where 13,000 British Indian troops surrendered to Ottoman forces. Following reinforcements and better logistics, General Frederick Stanley Maud's Second Offensive retook, cut, and advanced on Baghdad in March 1917. The Mesopotamian campaign underscored the brutal environment, disease, and supply challenges faced by Imperial troops. In East Africa, von Lettow-Vorbeck's forces, comprised of German escorias and African porters, used guerrilla tactics, moving through Tanganyika, Mozambique, and northern Rhodesia. Despite shortages, he tied down 300,000 Allied troops, exemplifying how a small colonial garrison could resist a much larger imperial war machine. Through WWI, the British Empire at war revealed both its strengths: a global network able to mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops and resources from every continent, and its contradictions: colonial soldiers risking their lives for an empire that denied them political equality. Yet the shared sacrifice forged bonds that would shape the interwar period as veterans returned home demanding greater rights and autonomy, laying groundwork for the empire's eventual unraveling in World War II and decolonization. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Britain once again turned to its imperial network for men, materiel, and strategic depth. Far from home, Dominion airfields, colonial ports, and Asian garrisons would become pivotal battlegrounds. 3 episodes: the Battle of Britain, the Fall of Singapore, and the Indian Army's campaign in Burma, exemplify both the strengths and strains of an empire stretched to the breaking point. yet ultimately vital to Britain's survival. The Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, marked the first major campaign waged entirely by air forces. Following the rapid conquest of France, Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe turned its attention across the Channel, aiming to achieve air superiority as a prelude to invasion. Britain's Royal Air Force RAF, though outnumbered, defended the skies through a combination of radar technology at chain home stations, decentralized early warning systems, and the valor of its pilots, some 2,900 of whom were overseas volunteers from across the empire. Key among these were the Commonwealth Airmen, Canadians of No. 1 and No. 242 squadrons, Australians in Nos. 10 and 452 squadrons, New Zealand volunteers in No. 485, South Africans in No. 1 SA Wing. Their contributions were disproportionate to their numbers. Australian ace Clive Killer Caldwell shot down 28 German aircraft, while New Zealander Alan Deer downed 22 from the Caribbean to India. Volunteers enlisted in RAF pathways, reinforcing fighter and bomber command. On August 15th now, commemorated as Battle of Britain, Day Fighter Command repelled massive Luftwaffe raids on London and southern England, a moral turning point that shattered Hitler's hopes of subjugating Britain through air power alone. Yet, while the metropole celebrated its finest hour, far to the east, the empire suffered its greatest military disaster. In December 1941, Japanese forces flown from Indochina and Malaya descended upon Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East. Britain had fortified the island against naval assault, but few defenses faced the landward Malay Peninsula. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival commanded a mixed force of British, Indian, Australian, and local troops, but hampered by inadequate armor, low morale, and disrupted supply lines. They were outmaneuvered by General Tomoyuki Yamashita's rapid advance down the peninsula on February 15, 1942. Percival's garrison of some 85,000 men surrendered, the largest capitulation in British military history. The fall of Singapore shook the empire to its core, exposing the vulnerability of colonial defenses and triggering a crisis of confidence. Indian troops who had fought in the Malay jungles were taken prisoner, some enduring years in Japanese camps. Colonial subjects, previously assured of British invincibility, now confronted the reality that the empire could falter amid these shocks. However, the Indian Army emerged as a cornerstone of the Allied effort in Asia. By 1942, it had expanded from 200,000 to over 2 million men, making it the largest volunteer army in history. Under Lord Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia, Indian and Commonwealth units battled Japanese and Thai forces in the Burma Campaign, grueling war of jungle, monsoon, and disease, from Impal and Kohima in the northeast, where the Japanese aimed to invade India in 1944, to the Irrawaddy River crossings in 1945. The fighting pushed both sides to the limits. Indian divisions, such as the 5th and 17th, exemplified tenacity in battles like Impal, where British and Indian forces defeated the Japanese, marking their first major land defeat. Engineers built the Lado Road, later the Stillwell Road, linking Assam and China, facilitating supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's forces. Gorkha regiments, recruited from Nepal but serving under British officers, gained legendary status for silent night attacks and fierce defensive stands in the Burmese hills. Throughout the conflict, Empire's resources were indispensable. Canadian shipyards turned out corvettes and destroyers to escort Atlantic convoys. Australian factories produced aircraft and tanks for North Africa and Europe. West African squadrons staffed RAF bases in Nigeria and Ghana. Indian railways carried troops and supplies to Assam and beyond. Tea plantations in Ceylon shipped millions of tons of tea and rubber needed for wartime industry. At home, British civilians endured the Blitz German bombing of cities from 1940 to 1941, sustained by food rations supplemented by imports from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Colonial mandate laborers in East Africa and India worked in munitions factories, while scholarship programs brought colonial students to British universities, strengthening educational ties that would endure beyond the war. By war's end in 1945, the British Empire had performed a massive logistical and military feat, fielding armies and navies across 6 continents. Yet, the combined strains of global war, nationalist movements, stirred by the British ideals of freedom and economic exhaustion, rendered the imperial project untenable. India achieved independence in 1947. In the ensuing decades, colonies across Africa and the Caribbean followed. Nonetheless, the 2 world wars underscored that, in moments of existential crisis, the empire's network, its dominions, colonies, protectorates remained vital to Britain's survival. Without the contributions of Canadians at Vimy and Normandy, Australians at El Alamein, Indians at Kohima and Impal, and Africans across theaters, Britain's fate might have differed. The shared sacrifices fostered post-war debates about self-government, laying the groundwork for the Commonwealth in which former colonies would join as equal partners, preserving a semblance of unity forged in wartime adversity. Decolonization. The empire unravels by the mid-20th century. The vast British Empire, once proud owner of a quarter of the world's land, faced an irreversible tide of decolonization, fueled by wartime sacrifices, rising nationalist movements, and changing international attitudes toward empire. Britain began to relinquish its most prized colonies. 2 transformational waves stand out: the independence and partition of India in 1947, and the subsequent winds of change that swept through Africa during the 1950s and 1960s. Indian independence and partition. 1947. India's path to freedom was both triumphant and tragic, a culmination of decades of Indian National Congress activism, the mass mobilization led by Mahatma Gandhi, and the strategic political negotiations of leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. After World War II, Britain, exhausted economically and under pressure from the United States and the United Nations, recognized that maintaining control over India was no longer tenable. In February 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee announced Britain's intention to leave India by June 1948. A hastily convened Mountbatten Plan, named after the last Viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, proposed partitioning British India into 2 dominions, a predominantly Hindu Union of India and a predominantly Muslim Pakistan. Boundaries would be drawn by Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer, based on religious majorities in districts, an impossible task in regions with intermingled communities. On August 15, 1947, the Indian Independence Act came into force. India and Pakistan became sovereign nations. Yet liberation was marred by the greatest mass migration in human history. As borders crystallized, an estimated 10 to 12 million Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims crossed newly minted frontiers to join the state, matching their faith. Amid the chaos, lack of administrative preparedness, communal violence, and breakdown of law and order, between 500,000 and 1 million lives were lost in riots, massacres, and revenge killings. Families were torn apart. Trains carried corpses. Entire villages emptied or burned. Despite the human tragedy, India's nascent government under Prime Minister Nehru set about establishing a secular democratic republic, adopting a constitution in 1950 that enshrined universal adult suffrage, fundamental rights, and federal structure. Pakistan, led by Governor General and then Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan, grappled with its own political instability, laying the seeds of military rule and eventual further Partitions in 1971. The British withdrawal from India thus stands as both a model of negotiated decolonization and a cautionary tale of the perils when communal divisions are politicized. Wave of African independence movements, 1950s, 1960s. While India's departure dominated headlines in 1947, Africa's long campaign for self-rule gathered momentum in the ensuing decade. Inspired by Indian independence, Pan-African leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, Kanada, Leopold, Sédar Senghor, and others organized political parties, labor unions, and student movements demanding autonomy from colonial administrators. The British response varied. In the Gold Coast, increasing African representation in the Legislative Council paved the way for the United Gold Coast Convention, 1947, and mass protests. Kwame Nkrumah, released from prison in 1951, transformed his convention People's Party into a popular force. By 1957, the Gold Coast achieved peaceful independence as Ghana, becoming the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free and capturing the world's imagination with ceremonial grandeur and Pan-African optimism. Across East Africa, the path to self-rule was more contested. In Kenya, the Momo Uprising 195260, a violent rebellion against land expropriation and colonial repression, forced Britain to confront its settler colonial policies. The brutal counterinsurgency deployed tens of thousands of British troops and police. It also led to mass detentions and allegations of atrocities. Yet, by 1963, Kenya held its first elections, and Jomo Kenyatta became Prime Minister in the independent Republic of Kenya in West Africa. Nigeria's journey followed a constitutional route. Graduated self-government beginning in 1954, with a federal system allowed regional premiers to assume power. After peaceful elections in 1960, Nigeria became independent, heralding the end of direct British rule in West Africa. Nearby, Sierra Leone, 1961, and Tanganyika, 1961, soon to unite with Zanzibar as Tanzania, 1964. It's followed suit. In southern Africa, the process was more protracted. The Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland incorporating modern Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi proved untenable amid rising African nationalism. Malawi and Zambia gained independence in 1964, while white minority ruled southern Rhodesia later. Zimbabwe would not become majority ruled until 1980. After a protracted guerrilla war, by the end of 1966, most British colonies in Africa had secured independence, often through negotiated constitutional conventions, but sometimes after violent struggle. The decolonization wave reflected shifting international norms recognition by the United Nations of self-determination as a universal right and Britain's own economic constraints, post-war austerity, the costs of maintaining distant garrisons, and the decline of the pound sterling reduced the appetite for imperial governance. Thus, between 1947 and the mid-1960s, Britain's once unassailable empire unraveled, giving birth to a new family of nations. These events marked the end of colonial dominion and the beginning of complex legacies, neo-colonial ties through the Commonwealth, disputes over borders drawn in colonial times, and enduring challenges of nation-building. Yet they also affirmed the universal aspiration for self-rule, signaling a transformative shift from empire to a world of sovereign nation-states. By the mid-1950s, Britain's imperial standing suffered both from earlier decolonization and the broader currents of Cold War geopolitics. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Suez Crisis of 1956, which exposed the limits of Britain's power and accelerated its transformation to a voluntary association of nations, the Commonwealth. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, seizing control of the vital waterway that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and served as Western Europe's lifeline to Middle Eastern oil. Britain and France Both major shareholders in the canal viewed Nasser's act as a threat to international trade and colonial prestige. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, self a veteran of World War II in the 1951-55 Suez Canal administration, believed that Western resolve must be demonstrated decisively behind closed doors. Britain and France reached a secret accord with Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, prompting British and French peacekeeping intervention to secure the canal. In late October 1956, Israeli troops advanced toward the canal. Within days, Anglo-French forces launched air and amphibious assaults on Port Said and Port Fouad, yet the operation disastrously backfired. Though militarily successful in seizing the canal zone, Britain and France faced immediate international condemnation. The United States, led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, refused to support what it saw as neocolonial aggression, pressuring London and Paris through economic threats, including selling U.S. holdings of British government debt to force a pound sterling devaluation. The Soviet Union likewise denounced the invasion, threatening intervention under the guise of Cold War solidarity with Egypt, under immense diplomatic and financial pressure. Britain and France agreed to a United Nations brokered ceasefire in early November 1956 and withdrew their forces by December. The canal returned to Egyptian control, and the UN Emergency Force history's first large-scale peacekeeping mission took over security responsibilities. Anthony Eden, whose career had rested on maintaining imperial influence, was politically destroyed and resigned in January 1957. The Suez Crisis signaled the moment when Britain's role as a global policeman and imperial guarantor definitively ended. It underscored that Cold War superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, now dictated the rules of international engagement, relegating Britain to junior partner status, economically depleted by post-war reconstruction, chronically short of dollars, and diplomatically isolated. Britain recognized it could no longer project unilateral military force in distant regions simultaneously. The empire continued its transformation into the Commonwealthy Voluntary Association of independent nations united by shared history, language, and institutions. Conceived at the 1926 Imperial Conference and formalized by the Statute of Westminster in 1931, the Commonwealth had initially been a patchwork of dominions retaining ties to the crown. After World War II's independence spread, new members India, 1947, Pakistan, 1947, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, 1948, Ghana, 1957, and Malaya, 1957, joined not as colonies, but as equal sovereign states, recognizing the British monarch as symbolic head of the Commonwealth. By 1965, at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOM, in London, participants celebrated the organization's expansion to over 30 nations across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Commonwealth meetings promoted cooperation on economic development, education, health, and defense, offering technical assistance programs such as the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme, through bodies like the Commonwealth Secretariat, established 1965, and the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation. Britain supported new nations' development without the coercive power of colonial rule. The Commonwealth's ethos unity in diversity, mutual respect, and peaceful cooperation reflected both nostalgia for shared heritage and a pragmatic recognition that Britain's future lay in partnership rather than empire. During the 1960s and 1970s, newly independent members cooperated on decolonization issues, Rhodesia, West Papua, trade preferences, Commonwealth preferential tariff, and cultural exchanges, Commonwealth Games. Though fraught with disagreements, over apartheid in South Africa, for example, provided a framework for sustained ties between former rulers and ruled. Thus, the Suez Crisis and the concurrent embrace of the Commonwealth embody the final pivot in Britain's imperial trajectory. The humiliating failure at Suez demonstrated that maintenance of empire by force was no longer possible. In its place arose a new model, a voluntary multilateral association that retained many features of the old imperial network common language, legal traditions, educational linkage while dispensing with direct political domination. From the mid-1950s onward, Britain found in the Commonwealth a means to preserve influence through soft power, marking the end of the Age of Empire and the beginning of a post-colonial era defined by cooperation rather than conquest. Echoes in Legacies, from Hong Kong to the Falklands, when the clock struck midnight on July 1st, 1997. The Union Jack was lowered for the last time at Government House in Hong Kong, and the People's Republic of China took control of the former British colony. That moment, 4 decades after the British Nationality Act of 1948 had extended citizenship to Hong Kong residents, marked the symbolic end of Britain's direct rule in Asia and underscored the enduring legacies of Empire. 1997 handover of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's handover was the culmination of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, signed in 1984 by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Chinese Premier Xiao Jiang, under the principle of one country, two systems. China promised to maintain Hong Kong's capitalist economy, legal autonomy, its way of life for 50 years after 1997. During the decade leading up to the handover, Hong Kong underwent a frenetic period of constitutional reform and political debate. The Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini-constitution, drafted under Chinese supervision and enacted in 1990, established the special administrative regions, institutions and executive, led by a chief executive, partially elected legislative council, and an independent judiciary. Despite assurances, many Hong Kongers worried about the preservation of civil liberties. In the lead-up to 1997, political parties formed around competing visions. Democratic Party activists demanded the swift introduction of fully direct elections, while pro-Beijing groups urged stability and gradual change. On June 30th, 1997, an emotional farewell ceremony took place on Victoria Harbour, broadcast live to more than 500 million viewers across Asia. Sir Christopher Patten, Hong Kong's last British governor, delivered a valedictory speech lauding the territory's rule of law, free press, and cultural diversity qualities that have flourished under British administration. Since 1997, Hong Kong has faced ongoing tensions between local identity and mainland authority. Protests in 2003 against proposed national security legislation, the large-scale umbrella movement in 2014 for universal suffrage, and massive demonstrations in 2019-20 against an extradition bill exemplify how the handover did not erase colonial legacies of civic engagement, legal rights, and public space. Hong Kongers continue to assert the values and rights inherited from British rule, even as the city's autonomy is tested under new security laws. Debates over statues, reparations, and memory as Britain's formal empire contracted. The question of how to remember or forget the imperial past emerged in public debates over monuments, reparations, and collective memory. Across the United Kingdom and former colonies, statues of colonial figures Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town and Oxford, Robert Clive in London, and Mahatma Gandhi in several Indian cities have become flashpoints. In 2020, amid global protests against racial injustice, calls grew to remove or contextualize statues of slave traders on Bristol's Harold Matthews Monument and London's Edward Colston statue. Colston, a powerful 17th century merchant and director of the Royal African Company, had profited from the transatlantic slave trade. When protesters in Bristol pulled his statue down and rolled it into the harbor, they underscored how public monuments can perpetuate uncritical colonial narratives. In Parliament and among historians, the Griffiths Commission, launched in 2021, began examining the legacies of imperialism, colonial violence, and the appropriateness of reparative measures. Debates center on whether Britain should issue formal apologies or compensation for colonial-era wrongs, forced labor under the Mauritius indenture system, famines in India under the Raj, and the crimes of conquest in Africa and the Middle East. Some argue that reparations could take the form of development aid, debt relief, or educational initiatives rather than direct financial payments. Others contend that such gestures risk simplification of complex histories or inadvertently burden contemporary citizens with historical guilt. Museums have also become arenas of contested memory. The British Museum, with galleries of Benin bronzes, looted by the Royal Navy in 1897, faces ongoing demands for restitution by Nigerian authorities. In response, the museum has established dialogues with loan programs and promises of collaborative curatorship. Yet full repatriation remains unresolved. Similarly, the Imperial War Museum and the National Maritime Museum grapple with how to present narratives of naval supremacy while acknowledging the subjugation and exploitation that powered Britain's global might. Across former colonies, public history initiatives seek to reclaim local perspectives. In India, partition museums in Amritsar and Delhi preserve oral testimonies of 1947's violence. In Kenya, the Momo Museum in Nairobi chronicles the brutal suppression of the anti-colonial revolt and honors its freedom fighters. In the Caribbean, emancipation memorials and festivals celebrate the abolition of slavery, confronting colonial histories. Yet memory remains contested. In some parts of the Caribbean and Pacific, statues of Queen Victoria or King George V still stand, and flags bearing Union Jacks flutter, signaling more positive associations with British infrastructural improvements and legal legacies. In Australia and Canada, debates over statues of Captain James Cook or John A. Macdonald, respected architects of colonial settlement, highlight tensions between indigenous rights, settler history, and national identity. These debates over statues, reparations, and memory reflect a broader reckoning: how to acknowledge the achievements, rule of law, global trade networks, infrastructure, parliamentary governance while confronting the violence, exploitation, and racial hierarchies inherent in empire. The legacies of the British Empire thus endure not only in far-flung institutions, but in the contested spaces of streets, museums, and textbooks, a testament to an imperial past that refuses to remain silent, challenging each new generation to balance heritage with historical justice. Even as decolonization removed most flags from foreign capitals, Britain retained a handful of overseas territories and maintained a global military presence that underscores its enduring strategic interests. Simultaneously, the empire's cultural legacies, particularly in language, law, and political institutions, continue to shape societies around the world. Following the handover of Hong Kong in 1997, Britain's territorial footprint contracted but did not vanish entirely. Today, 15 British overseas territories remain under the Crown. From the tropical beaches of Bermuda and the British Virgin Islands to the windswept peaks of the Falkland Islands and the remote volcanic islands of St. Helena, Sinchen, and Tristan da Cunha, in each territory, a locally elected government handles day-to-day affairs. The British government retains responsibility for defense, external relations, nowhere necessary financial assistance. The Falkland Islands, annexed in 1833, illustrate both permanence and peril. In 1982, Argentina's invasion sparked the Falklands War, drawing Britain into a 10-week conflict over 8,000 miles of ocean. A task force of carriers, destroyers, and logistical ships steamed south. Troops, including the Parachute Regiment and Royal Marines, recaptured the islands. Today, islands maintain a garrison of several hundred British troops and a runway capable of handling strategic airlift, demonstrating that, while Britain's empire has largely dissolved, its commitment to defend its remaining territories remains firm across the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia Flat Coral Atoll serves as a key Q's military base under a long-term lease, Britain allows the United States to station aircraft and naval assets there, supporting operations in the Middle East and Asia. The presence of American P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft and the occasional aircraft carrier anchoring at Diego Garcia underscored the island's strategic value. Even as their original inhabitants, Chagasins, continue to campaign for the right to return after 1960s forced removals. Elsewhere, territorial garrisons persist. On Gibraltar, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean. On Cyprus, sovereign base areas of Akrotiri and Dekelia, home to signals intelligence stations. Can and the Cayman Islands, Montserrat, and Anguilla, or small detachments of Royal Marines and local reservists aid in disaster relief and maritime security. These bases support drug interdiction in the Caribbean, counter-piracy patrols off East Africa, and rapid responses to global crises, reflecting the enduring utility of overseas territories in British defense doctrines. Parallel to these military outposts, the cultural legacies of the empire, language, legal systems, and parliamentary institutions have had, perhaps, an even more profound and lasting impact. The English language is the most visible inheritance. As the primary medium of business, diplomacy, and education in former colonies India, Nigeria, Singapore, Canada, Australia, English operates as a lingua franca, enabling communication across ethnic and linguistic divides. Globalized industries, from finance in Hong Kong to information technology in Bangalore, rely on English for technical manuals, contracts, and academic research. Furthermore, English's ubiquity in pop culture music, film, and the internet reinforces its position as the world's de facto second language. Britain's common law tradition extends across more than 50 jurisdictions. Courts in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and the Caribbean still reference precedents from English courts. The principles of judicial independence, habeas corpus, and trial by jury, though modified in local contexts, remain cornerstones of legal systems from Jamaica to Kenya. The law lords of the UK's former Judicial Committee of the Privy Council continue to serve as the highest appellate body for certain territories in Commonwealth countries, underscoring the ongoing linkages in jurisprudence. Politically, the model of parliamentary democracy with a bicameral legislature, cabinet government, and a ceremonial head of state remains influential. India's vibrant parliamentary debates, Canada's federal system, and Australia's Westminster-style parliaments all trace their structures to British prototypes. Even where republics have replaced monarchs, Ghana in 1960, Trinidad and Tobago. In 1976, the machinery of government often retains prime ministers, oppositions, and question periods reminiscent of the House of Commons beyond institutions. Civil service traditions, imported from Britain, merit-based recruitment, impartial administration, and codified procedures persist in many former colonies. Singapore's renowned administrative service, Malaysia's administrative and diplomatic service, CAL, and civil services across Africa still emphasize competitive examinations and career-long commitment to public duty, echoing the ethos of the British Home Civil Service. Collectively, these legacies weave a global tapestry in which echoes of empire inform contemporary governance, professional norms, and cultural practices, while political sovereignty now rests firmly with independent states. The institutional frameworks, legal concepts, and linguistic bonds inherited from Britain continue to facilitate cooperation through Commonwealth summits, legal exchanges, and educational programs that binds this diverse community of nations together. In sum, although Britain's formal empire has receded to a handful of territories and isolated bases, its military presence endures where strategic necessity demands, and its cultural inheritance shapes the lives of billions. Today, lasting influences underscore that the story of the British Empire did not conclude with decolonization. Transformed, embedding itself in global systems of language, law, and governance that remain central to the modern world. The empire remembered the British Empire, at its height, governed a quarter of the world's land and population, built networks of trade and communication, and projected power across time zones. Yet, with that achievement came profound contradictions, unparalleled infrastructure, and legal systems, alongside episodes of exploitation and violence. Reflecting on this vast chapter of history requires acknowledging both its achievements and its atrocities and exploring how literature, film, and collective nostalgia continue to shape our understanding of empire. Reflection on achievements. In Atrocities 1, cannot deny the scale of Britain's accomplishments. The common law framework introduced in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean has endured in hundreds of jurisdictions, offering predictable rules for commerce, property, and personal rights. The railway networks laid across India and Africa, though initially driven by imperial logistics, opened interior markets, facilitated the movement of people, and remained vital arteries of transportation. The telegraph and steamship lines that tied the empire together pioneered global communications, foreshadowing today's internet and container shipping systems. Universities in Delhi, Sydney, and Cape Town trace their origins to colonial foundations, educating generations of leaders. Yet, these benefits often came at a cost. Famines in India, most tragically, the Great Famine of 1876 to 78, were exacerbated by colonial economic policies, prioritizing cash crops over food grains. The suppression of the Moho uprising in Kenya involved mass detentions, forced labor, and torture in the 1950s, leaving lingering trauma among survivors and their descendants. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, where General Dyer ordered troops to fire on unarmed civilians, stands as a stark reminder of imperial brutality. Slavery, abolished in the British colonies only in 1833, had earlier underpinned much of the Caribbean economy, while indentured labor systems replaced it in the 19th century, perpetuating cycles of hardship. Acknowledging both sides of this legacy is essential for a balanced historical memory. It allows former colonial powers and colonized societies alike to confront uncomfortable truths, to commemorate achievements such as the end of the slave trade, alongside the need for accountability for injustices like forced removals in the Chagos Islands. Such reflection underpins contemporary debates over reparations, apologies, and educational curricula that strive to teach colonial history in its full complexity. Literature, film, and nostalgic cultural productions, memoirs, films, and television play a crucial role in how people remember the empire. Literature. Early 20th century novels by Joseph Conrad and E.M. Foster explored imperial psychology and moral ambiguities. Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1899, used the Congo Free State as a setting to critique colonial greed and dehumanization, while Foster's A Passage to India, 1924, dramatized cultural misunderstandings and racial tensions under the Raj. Their works continue to shape post-colonial discourse, prompting new generations to question imperial legacies. More recently, authors such as Salman Rushdie and Camilla Shamsi have revisited colonial contexts to examine identity, migration, and memory. Rushdie's Midnight's Children, 1981, uses magical realism to parallel India's independence with the birth of its protagonist, grappling with the fragmented aftermath of partition. In the Caribbean, novelists like Derek Walcott and Jean Rhys have explored how colonial histories shape cultural identities. Film and television have likewise influenced public consciousness. Historical epics such as David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, and Gurando Chada's Pride and Prejudice, 2004, vary in tone from grand adventure to cross-cultural comedy, but each reinforces aspects of imperial history. Documentaries like Adam Curtis's series, The Age of Empire, 2021, provide critical analyses of the motivations and consequences of imperial rule, while recent dramas like The Crown, 2016 present, dramatize royal and governmental interactions with colonies, subtly conveying the empire's human dimensions. Nostalgia for the empire, sometimes termed imperial nostalgia, manifests in heritage tourism, reenactments, and commemorative events. Afternoon tea services in colonial-style hotels in Mumbai or Hong Kong celebrate the ceremonial aspects of British rule, appealing to domestic and international tourists. Historic sites from Victoria Memorial in Calcutta to Statue of Victoria in Nairobi draw visitors interested in architectural grandeur. Meanwhile, regimental associations hold reunions for descendants of colonial soldiers, commemorating service in campaigns from the northwest frontier to North Africa. Yet, nostalgia can obscure historical realities, romanticize images of tea gardens and Raj bungalows, risks glossing over the inequities experienced by local laborers and peasants. Heritage interpretations in museums and former colonial buildings increasingly include critical perspectives, interactive exhibits that incorporate voices of those who suffered under empire, oral histories of Mwani fishermen displaced by naval bases, Kenyas of Kenyan detainees from the Momo era. Popular culture also engages with colonial legacies through satire and revisionism. Comedy sketches, graphic novels, and web series reimagine colonial scenarios to highlight absurdities of racial hierarchies. The video game Assassin's Creed Syndicate 2015 features Victorian London and touches on colonial themes, illustrating how interactive media can introduce younger audiences to historical contexts. Ultimately, the empire's memory continues to evolve. Scholarship in post-colonial studies, initiatives like the National Trust's Decolonizing Program and grassroots movements to rename streets and buildings demonstrate an ongoing process of reckoning. Simultaneously, diasporic communities, Indo-Caribbean, Anglo-African, British Asian, produce hybrid cultural expressions that draw on both home and ancestral histories, reminding us that imperial legacies live on in complex, interconnected ways. Reflecting on achievements and atrocities, and through literature, film, and nostalgia, the British Empire remains a potent subject of discussion. It invites us to consider how power shapes societies, to learn from past mistakes, and to understand how cultural memories, whether celebratory, commemorative, or critical, inform our collective identity in a post-imperial world, even decades after the formal end of colonial rule. The British Empire continues to provoke debates about history and reparations as societies grapple with the moral and material legacies of imperialism. At the same time, its lasting imprint in governance, commerce, and culture permeates the modern world, shaping institutions and identities in ways both visible and subtle. Continuing debates about history and reparations cross the former empire. Questions of redress for past wrongs have taken many forms. In the Caribbean, descendants of enslaved Africans have lobbied for compensation from the British government and financial institutions that profited from the slave trade. 2023, a high-profile court case in the UK Supreme Court examined whether British banks should pay reparations for their roles in financing plantations. Although the court ultimately ruled against direct payments, litigation has kept the conversation alive and prompted multinational corporations to issue public apologies and review their historical ties. In Mauritius, activists seek reparations for the indentured labor system that replaced slavery after 1834. They claim the British Empire coerced hundreds of thousands of Indian laborers into harsh working conditions on sugar estates, resulting in high mortality rates. Similarly, in Kenya, survivors of the MOHO detention camps filed lawsuits that led to a 2013 settlement. The British government formally apologized and paid £19.9 million in compensation to living former detainees, acknowledging acts of torture and other forms of ill treatment by colonial authorities. Educational curricula have also become battlegrounds for contested narratives. In the UK, Campaigns to decolonize history syllabi argue that textbooks must include the perspectives of colonized peoples, highlight resistance movements, and address imperial violence alongside Britain's technological and administrative achievements. Some schools have introduced modules on the Amritsar massacre, the Irish famine, and the Herero and Nama genocide in Southwest Africa, fostering a more nuanced understanding among students. Museums and heritage sites have responded by installing contextual plaques and curating exhibitions that address the darker aspects of empire. The National Maritime Museum in London, for instance, now displays artifacts from slave ships and interpretation boards detailing the conditions aboard those vessels. The Tate Modern has hosted art shows questioning colonial power dynamics, while the Imperial War Museum features galleries on colonial troops' contributions and the complexities of colonial recruitment. Legislatively, some governments have explored formal apologies. In 2018, Prime Minister Theresa May offered Britain's deep sorrow for its role in the transatlantic slave trade, but stopped short of a full apology. That gesture was met with criticism from activists who view an unqualified apology as a necessary step toward genuine reconciliation. Similar debates swirl in Canada over compensation for residential school survivors and institutions run by religious organizations under government mandate, triggering nationwide truth and reconciliation processes. These ongoing debates highlight how historical memory remains alive, demanding that former imperial powers reconcile pride in global contributions with accountability for suffering inflicted. Reparations need not be purely financial. They can include educational investments, cultural restitution, and policy reforms aimed at addressing structural inequalities. Rooted in colonialism, the British Empire's lasting imprint on the modern world beyond contested memories. The British Empire's structural legacies endure in global, political, legal, and economic systems. The Commonwealth of Nations, although transformed from an empire into a voluntary association, still convenes 56 member states that collaborate on issues ranging from climate change to trade. The Commonwealth Charter enshrines principles democracy, human rights, sustainable development that echo British constitutional traditions, even as they reflect post-colonial values. In finance, London Stock Exchange remains a preeminent global capital market, underwriting bonds and equities for corporations from Singapore to Johannesburg. The sterling area, once the currency bloc linking colonial economies to London, has given way to new arrangements like the Financial Action Task Force. But London's role as a financial hub persists, rooted in imperial-era networks of trade and capital flows. English common law continues to shape legal frameworks in many former colonies. Business contracts, property rights, and judicial procedures in jurisdictions from New Zealand to Nigeria reflect centuries-old precedents from English court decisions. Arbitration centers in Hong Kong and Singapore adjudicate thousands of international commercial disputes each year, leveraging the credibility and clarity of common law principles. Parliamentary democracy, another imperial export, remains the dominant form of governance in numerous countries. India's federal parliament, Canada's House of Commons, and Australia's Senate all mirror Westminster structures, complete with party systems, question time, and the role of an opposition. Even countries that have amended their systems, such as Trinidad and Tobago, often retain a prime ministerial model and ceremonial president, underscoring the influence of British constitutional conventions. Infrastructure, Legacies railways in India and East Africa, red telephone boxes in Gibraltar, and canal networks in Belize continue to serve modern societies. Educational institutions founded under colonial ruled Ely University, the University of Ghana, Macharia University remain leading centers of learning for their regions. The English language functions as a lingua franca in diplomacy, science, and entertainment. fueling global news services like the BBC World Service and multinational corporate communications. Cultural exports to owe much to empire. Cricket, once a symbol of imperial solidarity, has become a unifying sport across South Asia, the Caribbean, and Australasia, with worldwide audiences tuning into test matches, afternoon tea rituals, Shakespearean drama, and British culinary staples. Fish and chips. Afternoon teas find homes in eateries from Mumbai to Nairobi, adapted to local tastes, but preserving a distinctly British origin. In sum, the British Empire's imprint on the modern world is multifaceted. Though its political boundaries have dissolved, its financial institutions, legal systems, languages, and cultural practices continue to bind together disparate peoples. At the same time, debates over history and reparations ensure that this legacy remains contested, prompting ongoing reflection on how to honor positive achievements while acknowledging past injustices. In the 21st century, the empire lives on not as a sovereign power, but as a constellation of ideas, institutions, and memories that continue to shape global affairs and challenge us to learn from its complex, often contradictory heritage.